Hello, welcome back, everyone. Today, we start a new heart-touching series, an unexpected story from the Naruto universe. What if Gaara, the stoic Hokage, found his first love in the most unexpected place? Before I start video, please support me to reach 500 subscribers as soon as possible. And like the video, comment for more awesome content. Let's start this video. The loop of the G in the word Hokage had started off as a sharp, narrow point, mirroring the quick, dedicated manner in which the young Hokage had begun his work. As though every letter stole precious time, he had zoomed through hours of paperwork in minutes. That was until he realized that upon finishing with his reports, he would have nothing better to do than meet his council. In a desperate bid to prevent such interaction from happening, Gaara had taken to making sure every letter was taken care of. Now, the loop hung limp and fat as the leader of men took his time, idly swirling his pen on the yellowing parchment, begging for the working day to be over. He glanced around his office, ornate and grand. It swallowed him into a world he was unsure of. One moment, he was ushered away from public eye, and the next, limelight had been thrust upon him. Is it what he wanted? Even he did not know. He was avoiding meetings with his council, just to be rid of them, stopping servants from bringing him his lunch just so he did not have to endure their stares. Gaara was in a world he was yet to understand. Bored and alone, he sat at his desk, deceptively resolute, unknown to be fearful. The Hokage's gaze left his office and dropped down to the work in front of him. Was not there something that could tear him away from this place, from his station as a leader? Rubbing his eyes, he relaxed a little as a soft breeze flew in through his window and ruffled his crimson hair. Gaara! The Hokage looked up, alarmed as his elder brother barged into the office, a large smile on his face, a glass of something in his hand. Kankuro! Gaara nodded at his brother and watched, almost with jealousy, at the way his brother grinned and jostled and was happy. What would it be like to feel that way? Geez, you've only been Hokage 2 days, and they've given you this much work? Kankuro helped himself to the seat opposite Gaara's desk and picked up a bundle of papers, eyes madly skimming the pages. Deciding he had had enough of the interruption, Gaara put his head down and got back to work. I'm technically not Hokage until the festival, he murmured without looking up. Throwing the papers back down on the desk, Kankuro marched over to the window and gestured to the calm plains of Sunagakure. You are a man of power now, little brother. Kankuro ignored Gaara's look of boredom. Aren't you going to take advantage of all the benefits that comes with? A moment of silence. Are you almost done? The puppet master puffed out his chest in triumph, as he saw he had caught his brother's attention. Almost. Gaara glanced up at him with a quizzical look. Why? Kankuro swayed slightly as he walked over to him, put his hand on Gaara's desk, leant in and indicated with a nod to all the papers around them. Get over this insanity, and let us leave this place, he announced, dramatically. I feel completely walled in. He sniffed and could see Gaara was seriously considering the offer. It was exactly as Kankuro had said. He felt walled in too. Put in too small a box and told to stay put, that's what it felt like to be Hokage. He glanced down to the fat, pathetic G he had scribbled and made up his mind instantly. Where to? Gaara asked, already standing. But I don't want to go anywhere inappropriate, he added before his brother could respond. A place where politics is discussed, perhaps? Kankuro asked, trying to hide his smirk. Where they serve fine tea and contemplate the writings of the great philosophers? Gaara put on his robe to leave the palace. That sounds agreeable, the Kazich said with a nod, and, Gaara being Gaara, took no notice of the bellowing laugh his brother gave, or the massive pat on the back Kankuro gave him, then almost knocked him over in surprise. Agreeable, Kankuro murmured, ushering his brother out of the office. Very agreeable. Diamonds or rubies? Rubies or emeralds? Crushed silk or chiffon? Tea in a china cup or plum wine from a goblet? Decisions perhaps every girl wishes she could make every day, every hour, as AI did. Yes or no? The only question that mattered was left unuttered, non-existent in a world of choices, in a world of beautiful things. The girl with too many decisions to make closed the curtain that divided her sleeping quarters and her fountain room as she heard the footsteps of someone fast approaching. AI looked past her fountain to the mirror ahead and took in what she saw. Fair skin and dark hair with electric blue eyes that shone out in any darkness. She was slim and graceful, as she was trained to be. Was she beautiful? AI grimaced at the thought. How could she ever know the answer in this world that was bursting at the seams with other beautiful things? AI. She jumped at the sound of her name and proceeded to wash her hair at the fountain. She leant over, picked up a golden jug and plunged it into the water. She watched as rose petals, put there by another working girl, swirled and fought against the pull as they were sucked into the jug. It is your first show tonight. The voice, excited and sweet, came again from the other side of the curtain. Megumi-sama has picked out the finest silks. A heartbeat of silence. I hear the new Kazekage is coming. The voice had changed. No longer excited and jittery, but calm and dreamy. AI poured the water from the jug over her head and let out a deep breath as the cool water soothed her in Sunagekyu's heat. They are yet to announce his identity. AI responded in a bored voice, trying desperately to hide her nerves. It is kept secret until the festival. Her soft voice drifted with the steam through the curtain. He will keep his face covered, I think. Her friend responded. AI was unsure if she had even listened to her. Just like Miko, the girl behind the curtain, so carefree and witty. No wonder she was everyone's favorite dancer. Perhaps this new Kazekage will be a regular like the last. Miko's stream of consciousness filtered through the curtain to AI. Now he was handsome. She heard AI laugh. He was a lot older than you. So? All the Kazelives are old. It's because they are the most wise and best at fighting or something. I thought your conversations specialized in politics? You should know why. AI smiled. She enjoyed teasing Miko, and the relaxed conversation was soothing her nerves. Her smile faded as she pushed her hair back. Oh no! Does that mean that I'm just going to be dancing for an old man? It was Miko's turn to laugh. Yes, I suppose, she heard AI groan. But there will be the others. Others? Everyone is coming to see the new flower of the tea house. Miko responded happily. A few moments of silence passed. Miko knew these moments. She had experienced them a few years ago, when it was her first performance. When you do it a couple of times, Miko chirped in a hopeful voice, you will gain many admirers, and they will give you the most beautiful of gifts. AI nodded behind the curtain, not paying any attention, trying to keep her mind off it. Unbeknownst to AI, Miko took great offense to not being listened to, especially when she was trying to help. You know he might not be too wrinkly. Oh, be quiet, Miko! AI shouted over and slumped onto a marble seat by the fountain. I am not allowed to know his identity before everyone else, so I will never see him. AI reasoned to herself, but Miko was uninterested. Oh, imagine, Miko whispered dreamily. You and the Kazekage. That is like a dream come true for most of us. Looking around the room, Miko saw AI's clothes for her performance laid out on the bed. She went over and straightened them out, brushing the silk with her fingers and smiling as the gems shone and glittered in the lamplight. She heard AI push the curtain away to reveal herself in a towel, a look of distress on her face. What if he wants to? AI's voice trailed away, and she slumped her shoulders in defeat. What would it be like to be with someone you barely know? Miko raised an eyebrow. It was entirely unprofessional to speak in the way AI was. It implied she still had not given in to the rules of her job. AI, Miko said slowly, wondering how to proceed, but upon seeing the look of worry on AI's face, she quickly decided against a lecture. You will be fine, Miko reassured her. With a quick smile and nod of the head, she walked up to AI and kissed her on the forehead. Perhaps he will give you a nickname. It's a sure sign of affection. Miko laughed half-pile, and AI forced a smile. I'll prepare drinks. Miko beamed and put a reassuring hand on AI's shoulder. AI let her leave and looked over to the bed. Blush pink silk glistened at her as though reminding her, it's time. The troubled Kazekage rode in a carriage different to that of his brothers. If they were seen together, then people might guess the identity of the Kazekage, and it was a backward tradition, in Gaara's opinion, that they should not know until the festival. It also explained why Gaara had to wear this ridiculous garb, the traditional Kazekage uniform, complete with hat and face covering. Only his ocean-colored eyes were visible, while the rest of him thrashed and ripped at the material desperate to breathe. The claustrophobia led him to lower his window and lean out slightly to catch what little breeze was available in this part of Sunagakure. As he was taking a deep breath in, he saw his brother's carriage, a little further ahead, pull up in front of a house made of glass. The mere size of it impressed Gaara. The palace was not even that big. This house must have been at least 7 stories, with different colored glass burning as it reflected the dying sun. As Gaara took in the beautiful home, he thought he spied the moon sitting on the highest balcony, and he stared in utter fascination as it glittered and shone from its perch as though welcoming him home. Gaara entered the tea house flanked by his guards, and, through the crowds gathered around the tea house, he even spotted several of his council members wandering towards it in a drunken stupor. His brow furrowed in confusion as he continued to follow Kankuro into the grandiose building. This district was known for containing the nightlife of Suna. Why on earth would Kankuro bring him here to discuss politics? His thoughts were interrupted as they entered the building, and Gaara was stunned not only by the mere size, but by how beautiful it was. Everything seemed to be made of glass, all of varying shades, and the tea house seemed to be lit by starlight. Silvery light flittered and sparkled from lamps that lined the corridor they entered. Gaara kept well between his guards, entirely ambivalent to the whispers he heard around him, his eyes steadily fixed on his elder brother. Eventually, Gaara's gaze ventured to his surroundings, and noticed that the majority of people lining the corridors were women. Dressed in colors only found in dreams, they walked as though their footsteps were followed by the sound of twinkling stars. A group of them giggled as Gaara passed, and he looked to them. Flowers in their hair, and the sound of glitter at their feet, was actually produced by anklets. In a moment Gaara put it all together, and looked around for his brother in alarm. He could not be seen in a place like this. Kankuro-kun! Gaara heard a honey-dipped voice call for his brother, and strained to see around his guard to a larger, elderly woman who appraised Kankuro with great affection. It has been too long. The woman, dressed in alarming shades of pink that glittered with gold trim, held out a hand to Kankuro, which he took with equal cheeriness. Megumi-chan! Kankuro greeted her with a kiss on her hand, to which the woman Gaara now knew to be Megumi almost squealed in delight. The elderly woman was followed by a court of at least 8 girls, all in equally bright clothing, giving Kankuro a look that made Gaara almost blush with embarrassment. Megumi was about to tell the girls behind her something when she noticed him. "Kazekage-sama," she explained, and as she bowed, the girls behind her followed suit. "I am honored you have come to see us. Please," she gestured to the room behind her, and as though enchanted, the glass doors slowly opened to reveal a circular room, the edged lines with cushions, and low tables leaving the center of the room free for performance. Gaara followed Megumi and Kankuro into the grand room, flooded with light from a crystal chandelier the size of which Gaara had never seen. The floor and ceiling both had a mirrored marble pattern, with swirls of gold and flecks of silver to give the illusion of stars. The girls of Megumi's court followed Gaara as though chained to him. He glanced in the mirrors that lined the room and could see them all behind him, giggling and twirling their hair. Slowly, the young Kazekage became frustrated. Kankuro knew he hated places like this. It is completely inappropriate for a man of power to be seen here. Although, as they took their seats, on cushions around a low table, Gaara could see many members of council also in the room, and could feel his cheeks burn slightly as they all realized he was there. He would never let Kankuro forget this embar. The Kazekage's thoughts were interrupted by the sight of her. As though she were a bride being given away, Megumi-chan escorted in a girl who couldn't be any older than Gaara. She kept her eyes down out of respect for the Kazekage, and let herself be led by the older woman. Dark waves of silken hair fell to her hips, and Gaara watched, a strange feeling of amazement stirring up inside of him, as her hair dipped and swayed, following the movement of her hips as she walked. The girl wore a light shade of pink, and was surrounded by jewels, as though bathed in moonlight, and as she came closer Gaara strained his eyes to see her face. Fair skin and soft, petal-like lips was all he could see, for she kept her head down, and Gaara, unknowing of what feeling he was experiencing, had a sudden wave of frustration flow through him as he wanted to command her to look up, so he could see her eyes. "Gaara?" Kankuro whispered pointedly, and the Kazekage's wonderings were disturbed as he looked around to see a girl in yellow offer him sake. He took the drink, but only so he would not be interrupted again when trying to see the girl they brought in. Megumi had left the girl sat in the middle of the mirrored room and walked up to Kankuro. "This is AI," she beamed proudly, "my last student. It is her first performance." Gaara was no longer listening. His eyes were focused on her face, silently willing her to look up. There was silence for a few moments before the instrument started up. A string instrument, like a harp, struck a note, and the girl, as though she knew what it would do to him, looked up straight into his eyes. For a moment Gaara was breathless. They were the color of sapphire. Deep and haunting, they did not look away from him, and Gaara found that he could not tear his gaze from her. As though it were only the two of them in the room, she lifted her hands and began to twist them into shapes before petal lips parted and she sang. Gaara wasn't entirely sure what she was singing about. His eyes were hypnotized merely by her movement. She moved with such grace and elegance that the leader of men could not take his eyes away from her figure. Her voice spoke out to him for a moment, and he caught words of a first love she had been waiting for. The dancer called AI stood and walked over to another man in the audience. She sang to him sweet nothings for a while, and the drunkard threw a small red bag at her feet. AI thanked him with a smile and continued to sing. Megumi gestured to her student, and AI's gaze came upon the Kazekage. He could see her properly now. She looked so young and delicate, and Gaara found that his mouth became dry as she swayed her hips towards him. He quickly grabbed the sake and took a sip. AI came to sit in front of him, and although they were only feet apart, there seemed to be a greater distance between them. The realm of the Kazekage and that of a courtesan were miles apart, and yet he was mesmerized by her. Realizing that Gaara was distracted, Kankuro threw a red bag of jewels at her feet, and her eyes thanked him. Now that she was close, Gaara could hear what she was singing. "Stay a while, handsome stranger, our night has come," she sang to him, and Gaara found he was slowly moving forwards towards her. Upon realizing this, the Kazekage straightened up, and he could see her smirk at his enchantment. With a longing look of goodbye, AI stood and finished the dance. The song ended with her in the middle of the room. The story of her song having a happy ending, the stranger stayed until the end of forever. The men and women clapped as more silk bags were thrown to her feet. She thanked everyone with smiles, and then turned to walk away. Women walked to the middle of the room and picked up the bags before returning their attention to their customers. Feeling came back into Gaara's body, and he took a deep breath, as though he had stopped breathing for her entire performance. Kankuro leaned over to him. "What did you think?" Kankuro whispered as inconspicuously as possible. "She was beautiful?" "No, I think she was rather arrogant." Gaara's eyes narrowed as he saw her figure in the distance. "What?" Kankuro was shocked. He knew his brother disliked her profession, but there was no need to be so harsh. "She clearly thinks of herself very highly. Probably all the attention from these lecherous fools." Gaara gestured to the rest of the audience. "What's up with you?" Kankuro replied in disbelief. This was her first performance, the first time anyone has seen her. "They're going to ask you soon." "Ask what?" Gaara looked around, worried. "Kazekage-sama?" The girl in yellow who had sat next to him smiled. "Would you like to go and see AI in private?" Kankuro was sure his brother would say no, and was about to defuse the situation, but to his surprise, Gaara nodded. The women around them all squealed in delight as Gaara rose to his feet. "I'll just stay here." Kankuro winked at him as the women led Gaara to another room. Gaara looked back and saw his brother laughing with the other men, teasing the girls and calling for more sake. The Kazekage was growing tired and restless in his garb as he was led to AI's room. It was stuffy and uncomfortable in his outfit, and he was trying to deny that it was mainly due to nerves over meeting this girl. They stopped short outside a room with a huge blue door, which seemed to sparkle. But upon closer inspection, Gaara could see that the tiny flecks of light were small silver flowers painted onto the aging wood. The women bowed to him. "AI is just through the door." They left. Gaara looked at the door and thought for a moment before impulsively deciding on how to approach the situation. He glanced around to make sure no one was there, and took off his customary robes to reveal his civilian clothes beneath. Gaara wanted to see if she would still smirk at him, knowing it was the monster that the villagers knew as Gaara. He placed his robes behind a vase containing giant pink flowers, before pressing both hands to the cold wood of the door and pushing it open. The room was just as beautiful as the rest of the tea house, and Gaara spied the dancer sitting on a four-poster bed, her knees drawn up to her chest, still in her dancing clothes. As he approached her, Gaara saw her glance up at him. She lowered her gaze quickly. I knew exactly who this boy was. Gaara was notorious, of course, for being the youngest son of the 4th Kazekage, with the demon Shikaku sealed inside of him. Having primarily focused on history, I knew a great deal about the shinobi families of Sunagakure. She knew all there was to know about the boy. What she was not prepared for, however, was how effortlessly handsome he was. Her skin burned under his gaze. Those ocean-colored eyes seemed to penetrate her as she sat, begging for another chance to look at him. Cautiously, she let her eyes travel along the bed and up to him. Gaara walked to her, as though a warrior going into battle. He held himself to his full height and appraised her at the foot of her bed. They looked at each other for a moment, and Ai felt butterflies flutter in her stomach at the sight of him. Crimson waves of hair hid the kanji symbol on his forehead that Ai had read about, and those oceanic eyes looked at her with such intent that her body weakened. "Why do you look relived?" Gaara's voice was softer than she imagined. Those sapphire eyes glanced up at him, and she smiled upon realizing they must be the same age. Her voice faltered as she took in the sight of him. "I thought I would be seeing the Kazekage. I was worried I would do something wrong." She tried to finish her sentence as quickly as possible because she was growing frustrated that she could not speak when he looked at her. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, and she nodded slowly. "Gaara?" She spoke his name softly. "The shinobi?" He was surprised. "Are you not scared?" Gaara asked and folded his arms before narrowing his eyes on her. "No." Ai spoke with such confidence that it stirred something inside of him. "Because I can see you two are scared." She smirked and Gaara tried hard to hide his nerves. Why did this girl, who he had only known a few moments, make him so nervous? "You would rather see Gaara than the new Kazekage?" She nodded. "Oh, and what is so bad about the new Kazekage?" "It's just that." "Well," her voice dropped to a whisper, and she leant forwards. "He must be really old." For the first time in a long time, Gaara gave a small smile, and upon seeing it, Ai blushed. Another impulse rippled through him, and he moved away from the bed, and instead went to sit on a chair that was on the balcony outside. There were 2 chairs surrounding a low table. Gaara took his seat, and looked back for her. "There's no need to sit there." Gaara called to her. "Come out here. I wish to speak with you." "To speak with me?" Gaara heard her anklets before her voice. They tinkled with every footstep, and, as she came out into the nighttime, Gaara watched with childlike fascination as she looked with such love up to the starlit sky. She had wrapped her veil around herself like a shawl, and even as the veil dragged on the floor behind her, it made a melodious jingle. "I hear you are capable of having a conversation." She blushed at the harshness in his voice, and sat opposite him as he gestured. She found him so authoritative and commanding, but in a calm and even kind manner. Power seeped from him. Sabaka no Gaara was known for being violent and ill-tempered, able to strike down anyone who he wanted, but to her he acted with such a peaceful demeanor, she could not believe it was the person she had read about. "What is it you wish to talk of?" Ai asked, and Gaara had to pull himself together, as her dark-rimmed eyes appraised him with such innocence. "I want to ask you a question. See if you can answer it." Ai smiled. She liked riddles. As he talked, she began to remove her jewelry, and as it came off, Gaara could see it was pure gold, and the stones were all real. "Why is it all women are vain?" Gaara looked genuinely bemused until he saw the offense on her face, and was forced to smile a little at her pout. "Excuse me?" Ai looked at him and blushed as she realized that someone so handsome must have had their fair share of vain women. "I know of many women who only go outside at night to show the moon that they are more beautiful than her." Her eyes glanced down, and she blushed. He thought he'd stepped over some line, but she spoke again. "With respect, Gaara-sama, we are not vain." As she spoke, Ai began to remove her earrings. Gaara rolled his eyes at her answer, and was immediately shocked when she changed her mind and became angry. Even if we are, so what? She placed her foot onto a chair beside her and clicked her tongue impatiently as she struggled to remove her anklet. AI was struggling to remove the chain around her feet. The clasp was stuck and, she gasped as Gaara slipped off his chair and went to kneel in front of her. He could see her tense up in fear or nerves as he placed his fingertips on the metal around her ankle. The dancer got a hold of herself. Why should we not be vain or even arrogant? AI began, and as she did she lifted her foot and, as Gaara was trying to untie her anklet, she tugged her foot towards herself so Gaara was pulled towards her. He looked up at her. When we have the world at our feet? Gaara had stopped trying to untie the anklet, as he was enchanted merely by her lack of fear of him, but was pulled ever closer to her as she tugged again. She leant towards him and in a whisper added, "Even when we break hearts?" She tugged a little harder, and he had to move closer. "You have to admit we do it with a certain charm." Tugging again, he almost fell into her lap. He could not tear his eyes away from her deep blue ones. Their faces were merely inches away. Their breathing had hastened and Gaara could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Why not be vain when our beauty drives you crazy? She smiled at him, but her smile faded quickly as Gaara moved his face close to hers. Her eyes locked on his lips as he took a breath. He paused and saw her nervousness grow at what he was about to do. "Untied your anklet." He held it up for her to see and dropped it. AI quickly snatched it from the air and relaxed. She leant back to appraise her opponent. He sat back too and remained calm and controlled. It did not go unnoticed by Gaara that AI was annoyed. She stood haughtily and walked over to the edge of the balcony. According to her training, she knew she had to show disinterest to entice him and, to her surprise, it seemed to work. "Listen to me a moment." Gaara walked after her and was at her side in an instant. "Would you like to know the secret of your beauty and charm?" She turned to him and raised a quizzical eyebrow. "It is the weaker of men who behold magic in your mundane actions and honor your silly tantrums with attention." He growled at her. "We men make your looks legendary. Where would you be without us? If you think we owe our looks to you, then it is clear that your own beauty has you so intoxicated that you can't think straight." She scowled. "Why else would you talk such nonsense?" She turned away and walked off, but Gaara was too quick for her. He grabbed her hand and twisted her arm behind her back. "Hey!" I looked around for someone to help. "That hurts." She struggled and looked back to him in shock. But her struggling stopped at once, for she did not realize how close she was to him. She could feel his breath on the back of her neck. She looked deep into his eyes, and was grabbed by the intensity in them that their hold paralyzed her. "Obviously you have missed the point." His voice came out as a low growl. "Never mind. If vanity suits you then that's fine." She rolled her eyes and tried to move away, but he pulled her in closer so her back was against his chest. "Just don't forget," Gaara whispered, "that the glow of your face is because of me. It's clear now that we have cast a spell on you." She breathed. "With our petal-soft skin, lips like buds, and hair so dark and fragrant like the night." She glanced at him, waiting for a response. When he said nothing, she smiled triumphantly, pulled her arm out of his grip, and began to walk away into the room. "See what I mean? Not all girls have dark hair. You were just thinking of yourself." She turned back to him, fully irritated now. "Anyway, we're the ones who compared your skin to blossoms, lips to buds, and your hair to the beauty of the night," he whispered. Her eyes were glassy as though seeing him in some different light. His voice still held the growl as before, but there was something that made her catch her breath. "Is it not men who respond to your glance as if it's magical? And your words as if they are poetry? It is us who gave you this beauty. Don't forget that." Gaara looked at her once more and realized her eyes held defeat. He smiled with triumph and went to walk past her to exit the room. She held up a hand and placed it on his chest. "Listen to me a moment," she whispered. "What is there left to say? You are the ones who call us vain and arrogant, yet beautiful and elegant. So you know what?" He looked confused for a moment, and was startled when she looked up at him with a smile. "Don't blame us for your mistakes." Her eyes held daggers, and Gaara, frustrated with the feeling she stirred up inside of him, had had enough. "Here." He held up a bag and threw it at her. She caught it but did not look as if she had even registered his actions. She merely stared at him. What is it? Payment? For our time together. Farewell, AI. Gaara walked up to the door. Goodbye, Gaara-sama. He looked at her once more and they stood, caught in a mysterious bond of attraction, confusion and lust, neither knowing what to make of the other. He finally gained the courage to tear his eyes away from her and leave the room. Upon the door closing, AI sat on the bed, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Slowly she began to laugh. Who would have thought Gaara, the Jinchuriki, could be so? AI's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Come in. AI cringed under the hope that it was him again. Miko walked in, beaming at her friend who seemed breathless. That was really quick. Oh, you're still dressed. She looked disappointed and could not understand why AI was smiling so much. Yes, he just wanted to talk. AI shook her head. Well, what was he like? Miko asked and jumped on the bed. AI sat next to her, excited to tell her friend about her first encounter. He was, AI searched for the right word, arrogant. Miko laughed. And hot as sin. The girl's eyes misted over, and Miko raised an eyebrow. Real? Miko couldn't understand how her friend had such a quick change of heart towards her customer. I was speechless under his gaze, AI continued. Wow, Miko looked puzzled. At least you've made a good impression on the Hokage. AI turned to her friend sharply. Her look of far-off dreaminess suddenly replaced with one of wide-eyed in shock. Hokage? 2 days later, lost in a world of silk and golden thread, AI sat, transfixed, by the sight of red. It burned for her in the distance, bright and vibrant, mocking, almost, in the callous way the silk billowed and swayed when hung in front of the window. The red silk licked the floor as it moved, inviting her to wrap it around herself. Her thoughts traveled to her first meeting with him, with Gaara, the Jinchuriki. She sighed. So he had become the Hokage? With a small smile, she looked down to the white silk in her hands that she was supposed to be inspecting. He had become the greatest shinobi in the village. No wonder he was so arrogant and unnecessarily confrontational. He spoke to her as though he already owned her. But why did that make him so much more? AI? The sound of her name spoken so sharply snatched her out of her fantasies and threw her back into reality. In reality, she was sat on the floor, besides Megumi and Miko's throne-like chairs, as a merchant threw various fabrics into the air, letting them unfurl at the women's feet. Megumi was choosing material to be made into dresses for the women of the tea house to wear at the festival that evening. Megumi, Miko, and the tailor were looking at AI in alarm, and she followed their eyes downwards to her hands. Oh, sorry, she explained and released the white silk in her hands as she realized she had been clutching the delicate fabric with such a vice-like grip that she could have damaged it. Brushing her hair behind her ear in embarrassment, AI looked over to her teacher, whose look of alarm did not falter as she nodded towards the material in Miko's hands. Oh, AI spoke softly and looked down to the turquoise color that had caught Miko's eye and smiled her approval. It is beautiful, AI said, and stole a quick glance up at the red silk. The merchant, an elderly man that had been the tailor for the tea house for many years, saw her looking and smiled. Has red captured your attention, Utsukushi pretty one? He asked her, and AI jumped and blushed under such scrutiny. No, she said defiantly, and averted her eyes from the window. AI will be wearing white. Megumi, AI's teacher, stated without looking up from her inspection of the turquoise material Miko had chosen. Her aged hands ran along the cotton, which had silver threads spun throughout it to look like shooting stars. White? AI asked in surprise. Why on earth would Megumi-sama want to send her when she had argued with the Hokage, and who she had then described as arrogant to her fellow courtesans? Surely her meeting with him was a cause for embarrassment. The Hokage had practically stormed out. I'm going. Megumi looked up at the girl and sighed in exasperation before bowing her head to let her round glasses slide to the tip of her nose so she could look at AI properly. We have to present a gift to the Hokage on behalf of the tea house. But you will be suitable. But he, that is all, AI, Megumi stated in a matter-of-fact way. Suitable? The word echoed in AI's head as she sat in stony silence. From that moment, the meeting followed in the usual business-like manner. The vibrancy of the red silk seemed to fade away and dissolve into the background as AI sat, forced to stare at different shades of white, silently fuming at the thought of being in the same room as that egotistic, vain, good-looking fool. AI simply crossed her arms and pouted all the way through the fitting. Occasionally she nodded or murmured agreement until, eventually, the tailor left. AI stood as soon as Megumi and Miko had said goodbye to him and shut the doors. The young dancer tapped her feet impatiently to hear the jingle of her anklets. She lifted up her long skirt and inspected the chains on her feet to ensure there were no entanglements of the bells. Miko and Megumi were stood by the door where they had bid the tailor farewell, and, when Miko left, Megumi turned and appraised AI, who was inspecting her anklets, as though they had done her some personal insult. "I hope the Kazekage can see past the dark cloud of pride that spins above your head," Megumi said sternly, and AI looked at her in earnest. "I'm sorry, Sensei." The young girl let her shoulders fall in defeat. "It's just that, the way he talks to me, the way he looks at me. You would think he owns you?" Megumi raised an eyebrow at her student and waited for AI to respond. AI cast her eyes downwards and pulled all her hair to one side of her neck. There was no need to confirm it, for it was true. AI belonged to him the moment he threw the bag of coins to her at their first meeting. A few more moments of silence passed between the two women, both stuck on either sides of the courtesan world. The elder, Megumi, was too used to shutting her emotions away to realize exactly how I felt, and AI, the younger, was too naive to really understand the implications of her trade. AI watched out of the corner of her eye as her teacher walked over to her throne-like chair and sat down before gesturing for AI to sit in front of her. AI did as told and knelt in front of her teacher as she had been taught to do from the moment she arrived at this place. Megumi reached down and took AI's hands in hers. She looked deep into the young girl's blue eyes that were so full of hope. "You know why it has to be you?" Megumi asked in a voice that was dripping with melancholy. "Because you are untouched." AI lowered her gaze. She hated being reminded of the fact that her worth came down simply to her virginity. "That is suitable for a Kazekage." Megumi continued to speak, giving AI the age-old lecture that every courtesan hears from their master. "I am sure I do not need to remind you of your uses, of how to behave amongst men of power." Megumi questioned the young courtesan, who looked up at her and shook her head. "He will adore you," Megumi said sweetly, as though speaking to a daughter. The elder woman lifted her hand and stroked AI's hair in a motherly way. "He will marvel at your beauty and gasp in your seduction." AI lowered her head, her cheeks turning slightly pink. "And he may even tell you he loves you." After a moment of Megumi looking her up and down, she sighed. "You know, no one can truly love a courtesan, just as a courtesan can never truly love anyone. She sells only a dream of her heart, an imitation." Megumi put a finger under AI's chin and lifted the young girl's head to look up at her. "You know why I am telling you this?" AI nodded. "There is only heartbreak in love," she recited. AI inwardly scoffed. Her teacher had no idea that the person she was talking about was Gaara. She was lucky in one respect. Gaara, the monster, was incapable of loving anyone. In a strange, twisted way, it was a perfect match. The young Kazekage was sat at his desk, as he always was since his appointment, scribbling on papers, looking through mission reports, and occasionally requesting things from the servant outside his office. Gaara was reading through a particularly mundane report from a team of genin when his concentration was broken, and he heard it. A noise that had been haunting him for days, giving him tormented nights and hours full of lost thoughts. That damn tinkling, as though stars were falling to the earth and shattering into millions of tiny pieces. He heard it everywhere. He could not be rid of it. Today, he was supposed to be preparing for the traditions involved with accepting the position of Kazekage, but Gaara's thoughts were a world away from anything to do with the festival tonight. His mind was solely occupied by a vision of blue eyes, being licked and teased by dark, shimmering waves of hair. The young Kazekage, beside himself with frustration, ran a hand through his hair and sighed. The look on her face when he said goodbye was a look he will never forget. Her beautiful eyes narrowed on him, as though asking him to stay, and there was something in that look A feeling of want and confusion that stirred something in Gaara that he had taken 2 years to calm down. Something shook and vibrated in his very core at just the thought of her. "No!" he said out loud and brought his fist down on the table with such force that a small crack formed in the wood. This distraction was ridiculous. She was a courtesan. She sold herself, and that was something that Gaara simply could not fathom. Did it not insult her to be amongst women who degraded themselves? He stood from his desk, determined to find the source of the sound and be rid of it forever. As he stood, however, his elder sister entered the room. "Gaara?" Temari said, and raised an eyebrow at the look of surprise on her brother's face. "Going somewhere?" Gaara thought about how absurd it would sound to Temari if he told her he was being tormented by the sound of anklets. "Was coming to find you," he finished. "Oh!" Temari stood in the doorway and appraised her younger brother. He had been somewhat distracted for the past few days. Gaara was, perhaps, non-responsive most days, but distractions lead him to days without speaking a word to anyone. It was unnerving, this new Gaara, the quiet, respectful Kazekage that had come to be. Temari was sure it was merely the quiet before the storm. Gaara took a deep breath and exhaled as though irritated by something. "How are plans for this evening going?" he asked, hoping she would remember she had to organize something and leave. To his dismay, Temari smiled proudly and put her hands on her hips. "We are almost finished." The blonde shinobi could already tell her brother had stopped listening. "The council requires your presence in 1 hour to go over the Kazekage agreement," she said sharply, and Gaara looked up at her. "Oh yes, I'll be there." He rubbed the back of his neck and did not bid his sister farewell as she left the room with a cheerful wave. Temari closed the door behind her and leaned against the hardwood to contemplate what was happening. She thought Gaara might be nervous about today, but he seemed positively terrified. His mind seemed to be racing with thoughts he never let anyone in on. She bit her thumb impatiently as she walked away, and couldn't help but think Kankuro had something to do with this. The evening came quickly for the new Kazekage. Too quickly. He wanted to finish his work before the festival, but he had been so distracted that he ran out of time. He had already signed the formal agreement earlier that day, with his council and siblings as witnesses. Gaara thought of how his hand had trembled slightly as the weight of responsibility loomed over him before he signed. But before he knew it, Gaara was already a few steps from his brother and sister, who were stood, waiting to take him out to be seen by the village. "Oi, Gaara!" Kankuro called to him, and Gaara, feeling a little numb and apprehensive, looked down the corridor to his elder siblings and began to walk towards them. "How are you feeling?" Temari asked with a smile as he approached. She exchanged a quick look with Kankuro. Both had noticed Gaara's lack of enthusiasm for the impending evening. They were surprised, however, when Gaara took his place between them and looked at his sister with soft eyes. "What makes a good Kazekage?" he asked her, and the blonde shinobi bowed her head with a smile. "You do," she replied, and put a hand on his shoulder. Gaara turned as he felt the weight of Kankuro's hand fall onto his other shoulder. The puppeteer looked at his brother with a broad smile. "Ready?" Kankuro asked. Gaara nodded. The 3 Sand siblings walked in their line to the doors that lead to the palace's most grand balcony. It was a place where the Kazekage usually addressed his people in a time of crisis or jubilance. Gaara wondered which of those two would be felt tonight. He took a breath as the 2 huge wooden doors creaked open before them, and for a moment the light of the dying sun blinded Gaara as he walked out. He blinked against the golden light to see the inhabitants of Sunagakure stood in silence. Thousands of civilians looked up at the young Kazekage, who was stood on the balcony above them. Temari was greeted by a silence she knew too well. The silence of fear. Each member of the village saw Gaara stood before them, and could not believe their eyes. Would they accept him? "Gone," Gaara spoke suddenly, "are the times of hardship and violence." Temari turned to her brother, shocked to hear him speak like a born leader. "Gone are the hours of terror and silence." Temari felt her eyes begin to well up with tears. "I am your Kazekage, your servant, my people." Gaara's voice carried on the winds of the desert, down to the gathered crowd that stood in eerie silence. I bring the beginning of fortuitous days. Before Gaara had even finished his sentence, Sasuke erupted into a frenzy of cheers and shouts of celebration. Gaara, Kankuro whispered and wiped his eyes hurriedly as the red-headed Kazekage turned to him. What is it, Kankuro? Gaara asked softly, looking at both his siblings with a small frown. They were smiling, but their eyes were misted over. What strange emotion was that? Nothing, Kankuro replied, and, in an instant, his attitude changed and he embraced his brother. Let's celebrate. Yes, Temari shouted, and as soon as Kankuro let go of his younger brother, Temari grabbed a hold of Gaara, almost suffocating him. The evening passed much as Gaara had anticipated, being pushed back and forth to meet various people of his council, putting his hand in the air to wave at his people when they called him, eating with whoever gave him food, drinking with whoever gave him wine. As the day moved on and the sun began to set, Gaara found he was tired from the constant blushing over the attention everyone suddenly showed him. It's been a long day, I want to rest. Everyone seemed to agree with him on this, and as he left he had to endure many goodbyes before he reached the palace again. His escort left him here, and now he was sure he could hear the haunting sound of anklets once more. Gaara! He turned, not at the sound of his name, but at the tinkle of anklets. His expression of hope was replaced by mild disgust as he was approached by a slightly tipsy Kankuro. Oh, it's you! Gaara was actually talking to the girl in turquoise, who was draped over Kankuro's arm. She wore anklets. I think you'll find our friends at the tea house have left a gift for you in the palace. Kankuro winked at him. Gaara's eyes widened as Kankuro and the girl slinked away, back into the festivities. The Kazekage sighed before ascending the steps to his quarters. Gaara approached his bedroom door with caution. He had searched every other room in the palace, and they had been empty, so he was sure he would find the gift in here. He pushed the doors open and looked around the room. You? He stopped in shock at his door, as he saw who was in front of him. Kazekage. Ai was stood in the middle of the room and bowed as she addressed him, trying to hide her resentment for being back in the same room as him. What are you doing here? Gaara was puzzled by the intrusion, but shut the door behind him and walked into his room. I'm your gift, from the tea house, she answered with equal confusion. Why was he playing innocent? But why would they send you? Hey! She stood to her full height and dropped her sweet-toned voice before crossing her arms. I wasn't exactly too thrilled about it either, she pouted. You're angry at me? Gaara, too, folded his arms and looked her up and down as though she were an opponent to weigh up. You never told me you were the Kazekage. As she said it, Ai seemed to remember that he was indeed the Kazekage, and she should hold her tongue in front of him. She bowed her head and waited for him to speak. Gaara considered her for a moment, stood before him in a white silk dress, adorned with diamonds the size of which he had never seen. She even had a string of diamonds tied in her hair like a halo. Ai looked innocent and unaware of any effect she had on mankind. With her glistening pink lips and dark-rimmed eyes, Gaara found he could not hold on to his shock. Forgive me, he stated calmly, and as he did Ai looked up and unfolded her arms. How long are you here for? Gaara asked and removed his Kazekage hat before placing it on a table next to him. His sudden change in demeanor made Ai soften too. Perhaps she had been too quick to judge. I will stay at the palace for as long as you wish. Ai began to walk over to him as she saw he was going to remove the outer robe of the Kazekage uniform. Here, she murmured and put both her hands on his right shoulder. Allow me. Gaara looked down to her. She was mere inches from his face, glistening and glittering in diamonds, keeping her gaze purposefully averted. Ai pulled gently at the material and guided it off his right shoulder into her hands. She attempted to move to his left side, but he grabbed her hand before it reached his shoulder. Her skin was warm to his touch and so delicately soft. Gaara felt as though he could break her if he held her hand with too much strength. Finally her gaze met his, and Ai smiled sweetly at the look of distrust he gave her. To stop someone who is trying to help you, she whispered and almost blew the words gently into his ear, is simply bad manners, Kazekage. Gaara leant towards her. And to dance in front of intoxicated men, he paused for a moment, watching her grow intimidated by his closeness, is shameful. He let her hand go violently and walked past her, shrugging off the rest of his cloak as he did so. Gaara placed it on a chair beside his bed and turned to her. She had not moved. With her back to him, Ai spoke softly. "Were you not one of those men, Hokage?" She turned to him, her diamond earrings and bangles tinkling as she shimmered in the moonlight before him. Her eyes narrowed on him, and a smirk of triumph struck her face. The Hokage had met his match. Beneath his cloak, he wore a long black, full-sleeved shirt and dark trousers. He leaned against his bedpost, folded his arms, and watched the girl in white smirk in a way that made something in Gaara stir and wake. It was almost as though Shikaku could smell her, could want her, could see how fragile and delicate she was, could see how breakable she was. He tore his gaze from her in an attempt to calm this rising desire. Gaara had to get away from her, or she had to get away from him. "Leave." The young Hokage breathed the word as though suppressing anger. His tone frightened Ai, and he heard her jewelry jingle as she took a step back in fear. "Till morning, Hokage," Gaara heard her say, and looked up in time to see her white veil steal out of the door in her wake. The morning following the festival saw Suna buzzing with excitement over a new Hokage, over a new era of prosperity. The red-headed shinobi that they were all talking about walked through the palace greeted by smiles and cheerful waves to which he had no idea how to respond. Gaara simply nodded thanks to anyone who greeted him, and blushed as young women in the palace smiled at him in a way they had never done so before. In a way, Gaara almost missed being feared. At least then, he was not put under any pressure to interact with anyone. The Hokage approached his office and opened the door to find Ai lying on her front on the chaise chair that lined the windows of his office. She was dressed in shocking pink with the embroidery of pale green and blue flowers twisting around her figure. It was the simplest Gaara had ever seen her dressed, with a thin gold chain around her neck, matching minimalist anklets and bangles, and small gold studs in her ears. Her hair was tied up in a braid, but she let a few loose curls frame her face as she lay, nonchalant and unaware of her discourtesy. She looked like a doll, almost porcelain and ornate, lounging in his office as though it were hers. At the end of the chair she had put a small table on which she had placed playing cards. She did not look up as the Hokage entered. "What are you doing?" Gaara asked as he walked into his office. She kept her gaze on the playing cards in front of her, occasionally looking at the few cards she had in her hands. The pack of cards was decorated with flowers and golden numerals. Gaara eyed them with scrutiny. Winning a bet, the girl gestured to the cards laid out in front of her and continued to ignore him. Gaara sighed. "What are you doing in my office?" Gaara snarled and began to grow impatient as she still did not look over to him. Ai sighed and blew a curl softly away from her lips. Growing bored of the conversation offered therein, Ai replied with such insolence that the Hokage shut his door loudly, walked over to her, and waited for her to look up, all the while trying to prevent his brow from furrowing in frustration. He would not respect her actions by reacting to them. "Do you need something, Hokage?" Ai asked sweetly, and looked up to him with a smile. Her electric blue eyes, full of mischief, caught sight of his face, and for a moment, she was paralyzed by him. He noticed the smirk fade from her face as she took in the sight of him. Unaware, as Gaara always was, of what he did to women, he shoved an envelope in her face. "Take this to Kankuro," he said loudly, and it seemed to shock her back to earth. Her eyes widened and blinked up at him as Gaara nudged the letter towards her. After a moment, Ai shot him a look of indignation before returning to her game. The Hokage jerked in shock. "Hey!" he shouted at her. How dare she ignore him? Ai continued to pick up cards and inspect them before smiling and placing them into the growing pile in her hand. "You know, Hokage, the Agisu nightingale only sings when it hears music," she responded. "Ask a little sweeter, and I will consider your command." In less than a moment Gaara flicked his wrist. A gust of wind issued forth, scattering her cards onto the carpet. "Goodness!" Ai exclaimed and sat up as he walked past her. "Upon hearing them know you bring such a tempest to my doorstep?" The young Hokage went to sit at his desk and looked at her with a bored expression. She spoke such an ancient dialect. Her riddles and poetry infuriated him as much as her actions. "You have a terrible temper." She giggled and answered his expression, which clearly suggested he did not want to be spoken to so enigmatically. Gaara looked at her with bored eyes before deciding to treat her with the same disdain she had shown him. He took the papers on the desk in front of him and began to work. She eyed him coyly from her robes of deep pink, her big blue eyes giving him sideways glances as she slinked over to his bookshelf. Holding her cards tightly in her hand, she walked alongside the Kazekage's private library towards him until she came to his desk. AI stood opposite him, opposing him, daring him to speak again, but Gaara remained steadfast and kept his eyes on his work, trying to show her he did not care for her company. He refused to even ask her to leave. "Come," AI said softly, so softly in fact that Gaara looked up at her, wondering what had changed her attitude suddenly. She stood at the edge of his desk, her cards hanging loosely in her right hand. "If you can place the letter in my hands, I will do as you say." Slowly the Kazekage rose, accepting her challenge, and the girl's eyes flooded with mischief once more. Quickly, Gaara snatched the cards from her hand, and she gasped in offense. "Hey, give them back," she explained, and went to grab them as Gaara extended them to her, but he snatched them back in an instant. "Sorry, would you like me to do something for you?" he asked mockingly, and extended them to her. "Hey!" she pouted and went to grab them again, but he moved them out of her grasp. "Sorry," he said after seeing her pout, and went to put them on the desk between them. As AI went to retrieve her cards in a rush, Gaara snatched them out of her reach so that AI's hand came down on the table with such force that she withdrew her hand instantly and cried out in pain. "Ouch!" she gasped and looked up at him with a hurtful look, cradling her hand. "I was mistaken." She turned from him in a huff. "You are Raijin, A/N, god of thunder and lightning." She is likening Gaara to the Tempest mentioned earlier himself. She turned from him with a hurtful look and crossed her arms in frustration. Gaara was unsure if it were out of annoyance or guilt, but he did not like to see her upset. He walked around the table to stand in front of her and handed her the cards. "Please," he asked the nightingale, "will you take the letter?" With an appreciative smile, AI held out her hand. Gaara went to place the letter in her outstretched hand, but her smile was replaced by a look of malevolence, and she threw the cards in his face viciously. Without his gourd, Sand did not let him shelter from her revenge, and she gave him a look of triumph. AI had not even blinked before. "Kazekage," AI gasped as Gaara moved so quickly, she did not have time to register him, put his hand up, and grab a handful of her hair. She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes, and he stared back at her. His face was passive and gentle, as though nothing unusual was happening, but AI could see that there was something behind his eyes that she had never seen before. A violent intent that flooded her with dread before he had seemed playful, but this horror was real. AI put a hand on his where he was holding her hair, and looked up at him in fear. "Do you know what the tempest does to the moon?" he growled, looking into her fear-filled eyes, breathing in her scent. She remained quiet. "It clouds it in darkness, swallows it in anguish." As she tried to wriggle free, he pulled harder, and shivered in pleasure, as he saw the look of pain on her face. "Leave, whore!" He snapped and let go of her hair. AI recoiled and cowered away from him, her eyes watering from pain. "Women of sin are not fit to wander the same halls as a Kage." He spat at her and walked back to his chair. She remained with her back to him, her beautiful hair that she took hours to set for him, now askew with curls falling loose of the braid. "Whore." She laughed as she said it. Her shoulders shook, judged by a title that was thrust upon me by forces beyond my control. She turned to him quickly, her eyes burning with tears of frustration. "Tell me, Kazekage, do the raindrops dodge me as I walk? Does the sunlight hide away from my face for the shame of touching me? Do the winds of Suna not offer me pleasurable salvation in the summer months?" She paused and waited for him to respond. The Kazekage looked away, and AI, aware of her own vulnerability, dropped her gaze. "If nature does not discriminate, why do you?" A sickly smile adorned her face. "We are the same, you and I, Gaara." Upon hearing her say his given name, he looked up to her, a feeling of guilt rising in his stomach. Both put into positions, that we did not ask for, and then forced to play out that role. You escaped, she laughed and gestured to him, because you are a shinobi, because you are the son of a Kazekage, because you are a man. AI spat at him, and shook her head in resignation as Gaara looked away. A whore. She paused, her emotions flooding her. I defy you, Kazekage, find another woman who speaks as though she were the daughter of Benton, A/N, goddess of words, speech, eloquence, etc. One who can tell you how to resolve political difficulties in a moment, who can recount the great history of our village, who can leave you as satisfied as I can. She stopped, taking pleasure in the color that rose in his cheeks upon hearing her spoke so bluntly. Bring this celestial creature to me, and I will kiss the ground on which she walks. AI looked at him in disgust. Yes, I am a whore, AI said, holding herself to her full height. Do we courtesans not have hearts? She asked him. Do we not bleed? Are we not human? At her own words, AI gasped as a tear fell from her eyelashes. How did she let her emotions get the better of her? The fragile girl seemed to remember who she was talking to and bowed. Whatever your wish, Kazekage, I shall take my leave, she stated without emotion. The girl in pink turned away gently and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the doorknob. In case you are wondering, I won my bet. She cocked her head back to him and saw his face, full of incomprehension. You are heartless. With the last word, she left his office. Mornings in the Kazekage's palace were unmatched. Desert sunlight, golden and warming, flooded rooms to the brim with a shining brilliance. If you woke early enough, before the servants began to bang the water pots in the kitchen and call out to each other with instructions on how to maintain the grandeur of the place, you could hear birdsong. Sweet and mesmerizing, the birds of Suna spoke to anyone who dared listen, while they recounted the tales of the night. The quiet of morning, the peace that Suna felt in the early hours of the day, was unrivaled, in AI's opinion, and as she walked quietly through the palace, she found herself becoming lost and enchanted by the beautiful solitude that presented itself. It did not, however, shake a more pressing matter from her mind. 3 days had passed since her argument with the Kazekage, and it was a conversation that would haunt her forever, for it spread around the courtesan community like wildfire in the hours following the incident. AI had spoken out of turn, out of naivete, and offended the Kazekage. But this news was not the biggest rumor spinning around her head in lost whispers. She knew the women of the tea house, other houses even, were talking about it. AI could feel the chill in the wind as she walked past them and endured their sneers. They all knew it. Megumi knew it. It weighed on her like a dark cloud of incompetence. AI had failed to seduce the Kazekage. After he had told her to leave, she kept to her word and avoided him like the other side of a river bank, ever twisting, ever following, never to meet the other side. They had not seen each other since, and AI could feel the reputation of the tea house slipping from her grasp. Failure to solidify her relationship with the Kazekage meant that the tea house would be known for having second-rate, Kazekage rejected, average dancers. It meant that her own reputation as a dancer would be diminished before her career even began. It was a business transaction. He was a client, and she needed to fulfill a contract. And yet she felt that there was so much more going on behind those ocean eyes. AI. She turned at the sound of her name, just as she was about to enter the quarters of the palace that usually housed the courtesans. The young dancer had a look of polite interest as a man, a few years older than her, with a mess of brown hair, approached her with a smile. Yes? She asked sweetly, and the look of innocence on her face made the boy laugh as he realized she did not recognize him. He came to a halt beside her. It's me. As he spoke, she raised an eyebrow before a look of realization took over her features. Kankuro-san. She smiled up at him, taking in his face without the usual purple paint. You have a handsome face. Why do you mar what the gods gave you with war paint? He blinked down at her, a thin smile spreading across his face. So delicate and simple. How on earth did she match up with his younger, bloodthirsty, erratically aggressive brother, dressed in blue? AI made hearts melt. But could the warmth of her do anything to the Kazekage, famous for having a heart of stone? Kankuro's smile faded at the thought of this. Gaara could hurt this innocent girl with just a look. Even you hide your face behind a veil, Kankuro answered as they walked through to the courtyard that was devoted to the courtesans by some ancient Kazekage. AI smiled coyly and was about to respond when another voice joined the fray. Word has it that 3 nights have passed, and the Kazekage and his first courtesan are yet to sleep in the same room. Miko, AI's friend from the tea house, teased her as she walked up to the pair and handed Kankuro some tea. AI narrowed her eyes on her friend. Why, Miko-chan, we all know the most beautiful of flowers bloom last. The sunshine of summer is reserved for them alone. Kankuro beamed. You speak so wonderfully, AI. The dancer looked over with an appreciative smile and bowed her head. You have stolen my heart. Upon hearing this, laughter filled the air like soft singing as the gathered women showed their appreciation for Kankuro's words. But AI could sense it, could feel the daggers in their breath on her neck as they all waited to see her fail. Kankuro was led away by a few other dancers as AI stood awkwardly, not wanting to meet anyone for fear of their prying questions. AI, the dark-haired girl, looked up and, avoiding everyone else's eye, saw her sensei stood at an iron table in the courtyard. The table was littered with cups of tea, small biscuits and chocolates, along with books of poetry and the works of the great philosophers. Megumi had clearly just finished her breakfast and was beckoning AI with a stern look. Come! Megumi looked down at her student through her circular glasses and saw AI blush a little and lower her gaze as everyone in the courtyard sat in silence and stared at her. She could feel their glares, their smirks, hear their petty comments about how she had not yet managed to seduce the Jinchuriki. AI walked with her head lowered to meet her teacher, who said nothing but began to walk into the Kazekage's garden. AI followed intently. The gardens in the palace were exquisite, maintained by botanists or magicians, and I could not tell, for there were plants of which she had never seen before. They offered shade and fruit and flowers of all kinds, so the girl was sure there must be some magic afoot. The gardens were the only place you found true greenery in Suna, and there was even a small, man-made pond. AI glanced around, taking deep breaths every so often to take in the smell of honeysuckle. After a few minutes of walking in silence, a few paces behind her teacher, with nothing but the birdsong for company, AI grew restless. She walked a little quicker until she was at Megumi's side and stopped. Megumi-sama, I know I am yet to. What kind of tree is this? Megumi stopped and interrupted her. Without looking at AI, she held up her hand and pointed to a tree which draped over the pond with pale pink blossoms. AI looked over quickly, but did not register what her teacher wanted from her. The Kazekage will not see me, AI pleaded desperately, but her teacher remained unaffected. What tree is this? Megumi asked again, still looking over at the pond. I don't know. The girl in blue grew impatient with her teacher's lack of attention. You do not know? Megumi turned to her, an eyebrow raised, and it was that look that indicated to AI that she was now in serious trouble. A courtesan does not know the name of such a beautiful object? AI looked to the floor. She knew what was coming. She was going to be scolded. You forget yourself, AI, Megumi stated loudly, dangerously, as though daring her student to voice any other childish thoughts. Try again. AI sighed and looked over, taking in a delicate way the dark branches twisted and twirled and dipped into the water, causing ripples to spread out over the crystal clear reflection of the sky. She could see a few blossoms break away and dance to safety on the light Suna breeze. It is Sakura, AI said quietly, embarrassed for losing her composure. A cherry tree, she finished feebly. My dearest, AI, Megumi spoke softly, and put a finger under AI's chin to lift the girl's head so they could look one another. Do I really need to explain to you how important it is that we solidify our relationship with the new Kazekage in council? AI blinked up at her, feeling lost. He shirks me as though I were the rain. AI shook her head. His words burned me like a chilling winter wind. He is merciless. She bit her lip in frustration. Does he intimidate you? Megumi asked. No, the young courtesan faltered, and could see from the look on Megumi's face that the teacher had figured it all out. There is a power in his every movement, AI explained, and began to walk after Megumi as her teacher started to walk again. I cannot tear myself away from whatever oath he binds me to. I stumble over my words and forget how to breathe whenever he's around me. You are infatuated? I know. Megumi smirked as AI tried to wriggle out of the corner she had put herself in. I am intimidated by his aggression, she finished, not knowing how to continue. AI, Megumi stated simply, you are intimidated. AI inwardly rolled her eyes. Was Megumi really going to patronize her? It is a big task to ask of you. Gaara is a man who possesses infinite virtues. He is of noble blood. He possesses riches, power. He is the most skilled shinobi in this village, and the most powerful Kazekage we have ever known. You are beautiful, poised, elegant, intelligent, and many men have compared you to the silent, radiant moon. The elder woman spoke as though to herself. You are faced with this man, this daunting task of seduction, and you are young, inexperienced, and have a terrible habit of talking back. She smiled as AI opened her mouth to protest, but then shut it quickly. He has shirked you not once, but twice now, and I understand what that can do to a dancer's confidence. You feel powerless against him? AI did not need to respond. It was all true. That was exactly how she felt. Seduction seemed near impossible with his hatred of her profession. It seems as though we have reached a stalemate. Megumi stopped walking and AI stood beside her, lost in thoughts of how to tip the balance of power in her favor. You are overthinking things, my dear. AI shook her head. I'm afraid I cannot think at all. I have no idea what it is I need to do to move this relationship further. AI mumbled. You have the skill, AI, to seduce anyone you wish. Megumi reached out a hand as a cherry blossom floated down to the pair. She caught it in her palm and showed it to AI. You have simply lost confidence, and that will come once you remember that you are seducing the youngest Kazekage in history. He is just as scared and youthful as you are. As AI looked at her uncomprehendingly, Megumi tapped the girl's forehead, an affectionate way of showing her she was being naive. Gaara is a virgin. Megumi laughed as color rushed and forced their way from AI's insides to her skin. All this whole time, AI had not even thought about it. The way he spoke, the way he held himself, you would think it were the last thing on his mind. The Kazekage is fighting a losing battle, caught between his desire for you and his distrust of dancers. Megumi leant in as AI peered at the flower in her hand, a smile spreading across the young girl's face. He is trying to resist the pull of the moon. The wiser courtesan smiled. Surely she will put up a fight to conquer this rebellion? Her face aglow with recharged confidence, AI smiled and blew the cherry blossom from Megumi's hand. I shall. The great philosophers fall into 4 categories, the most modern of which Sunagekure takes as its political philosophy. Gaara nodded as his tutor, Hanasama, an elder female teacher of the village, continued to recite her lesson. They were sat on cushions that had been laid out by servants on the Kazekage's balcony. The balcony was more like a veranda, a huge wooden square that hung over the courtyard of the palace, as the Kazekage's quarters were on the 5th floor. The palace was shaped like a rectangle with the middle occupied by courtyards that housed the gardens. The gardens were lined with the 4 walls of the palace. Each floor had an open walkway so that members of the council, the Kazekage's family and guests, could walk out on each floor to view the gardens below. The sun was at its highest point in the sky and shone down onto the palace, illuminating everything with a golden light and unforgiving heat. The smell of flowers drifted up to the teacher and student as they sat, both enduring the heat. It was the usual setting for Gaara's lessons that did not pertain to shinobi skills. It was here that he learned how to be a Kage. Hanasama taught him most of the things he did not learn as a shinobi. Politics, economics, history. The list seemed to go on forever, and Gaara, known for not being the most patient man, was growing restless. He found the white Kazekage robe a little suffocating, as it had a high neck that twisted around him. At least, he didn't have to wear the hat in his private quarters. The young Kazekage liked to have his lessons here, as he found his office stuffy at this time of the day. The breeze of Suna comforted and consoled him as he sat, bored, listening to his aged teacher rattle on about something from 1,000 years ago. Tea was served before the lesson began, and Gaara found himself idly swirling the contents of his cup, wondering if it would be possible to drown himself in the contents. It was known as the Enlightenment period. She continued to recite in front of him, as though from a book, and Gaara, who was nodding along with her monotonous banter, spied something unusual in the distance. As inconspicuously as possible, he stole a glance over at the balcony that lined the northern side of the palace. It looked as though he were glancing at Hana's shoulder, but Gaara was intrigued by what was going on behind her. One floor below, on the walkway, Temari had been stopped by a gardener who looked thunderous. "Wretched thief!" The gardener, a short and feeble-looking man, shouted at her, and, as Temari had only been innocently walking to the library, she raised an eyebrow at him with a look that could kill. Gaara's elder sister spoke, but he could not hear her for the distance. The gardener, on the other hand, let his frustration determine the volume at which he spoke. "Starlight came down to earth and tricked me," he shouted at the blonde shinobi who folded her arms. So he was not accusing her of thievery. "She convinced me that I did not have Tsubaki, A/N, red camellia flower, growing in the greenhouse, and when I turned to show her she stole a birdcage and ran into the palace." Gaara looked away quickly to Hana-sama and nodded again, to maintain the illusion of focus, before he let his eyes flit back to the commotion. While Temari was trying to calm the gardener down, Gaara caught sight of Starlight running along the balcony on the floor directly below the pair. AI was in blue. She ran through the palace as though it were a fairground, dodging diplomats, and running through groups of women who cursed her name as she scattered them in fear. Directly below Temari and the gardener she stopped, and Gaara could see her laughing as the walkway emptied. Her veil had fallen from her head and been lost somewhere during the chase, but he knew it was her. She glittered in the Suna sun and her smile lit up the world. "Hey, where did she go?" AI jumped, and Gaara, his heart beating a little faster, watched in a confusing mix of bewilderment and respect as the girl glanced around her, wondering where to hide from the oncoming guard that were chasing her. All over a birdcage? Gaara wondered what on earth she wanted with it, and why on earth the gardener had called the guards over such a petty thing. If we look back through time over each Kage's position, Hana-sama, oblivious to the world around her, did not notice that the Kage was paying no attention to her and sat, transfixed, at the scene unfolding on the balconies beyond them. Temari and the gardener had also heard the guard's shouts, and proceeded to make their way to the lower balcony where AI was. The courtesan was being cornered. The guards were coming from the right, and Temari and the gardener were coming from the left. There were no doors to go through, no way down. She was doomed. Gaara watched AI as she looked around for somewhere to run or hide before he did something he could not explain. A mass of sand, like a cloud, hovered in the air beyond the balcony as though beckoning her. Blue eyes narrowed on it as she took a few tentative steps towards the edge of the balcony. AI thought for a moment before she heard the voices of Temari and the gardener approaching, and, without hesitation, she jumped up onto the railing and, with a lot of faith, jumped down onto the cloud of sand. It took a moment for her to adjust her balance, but when she did, the sand lowered, keeping her out of sight to those on the balcony of the third floor. AI crouched on the sand behind a pillar, taking in the sweet scent of the roses, unaware that he was watching her. "If you are inattentive, Gaara-kun, I may leave you to your daydreams of her." Gaara snapped his gaze back to Hana-sama, and saw that she had turned her head to see AI floating on sand a little way behind her. "Forgive me, Hana-sama," Gaara said, and looked down to the teacup in his hands. Hana turned back to the Kazekage and smirked. "I will suspend our lesson for today, Kazekage," she spoke in a croaky, ancient voice and stood. Gaara stood out of respect to see her out. "I hope tomorrow will be less full of distraction." "Yes, sorry." The red-headed shinobi flushed with embarrassment and nodded his thanks to her as she left. He could hear her muttering about back in her day as he turned back to see Temari speaking with the gardener and the guards. All stood on the balcony to which AI had run, wondering where she had disappeared to. The gardener was waving his hands in the air dramatically, and Gaara could see AI, hidden from their view, silently laughing into her hands. The group on the balcony dispersed, and soon it was empty. Without even moving, without even being consciously aware of it, Gaara made the sand that AI was stood on move higher to let her slip back onto the veranda. The Kazekage looked on, trying denying this strange new feeling that felt as though it was slipping itself into his bloodstream. As AI landed softly on the veranda, she turned to the sand. The girl being chased as Starlight looked around for the person who was helping her, but her blue eyes could not find his. She took a step towards the sand and lifted her left hand to her mouth, and slowly, as Gaara watched with bated breath, she bowed her head, closed her eyes, and pushed her lips against a ring on her finger. In thanks, she took the ring off her hand and placed it on top of the sand. With another quick glance up at the heavens, as though he might be there, she smiled and walked away. Hours had passed since the incident on the palace balconies, and Gaara could not shake it from his mind. Why was it, wherever AI went, chaos seemed to follow after? It baffled him that he cared so much, that he wanted to know why she would run for a couple of birds. Why would the girl bother to steal? Why did she act with no consent to consequences? It ate at him. Why did he care so much? It was driving him mad with curiosity. He had not seen her for days, and had been trying to forget her, but somehow, she managed to tumble back into his life. Her presence was a nuisance, a distraction. She acted so bizarrely, so out of whim and heart that he, bound by the role given to him at birth, could not understand her. The ring she had placed on the sand now sat, mocking him with its brilliance, on his desk, sparkling in the light of a dying sun. It was every inch of her, beautiful and delicate, annoyingly unlike him or anything he knew to be wonderful. It was a plain silver band with a large, rectangular, blue stone, an aquamarine according to Temari, who had asked about it earlier. He shot at a look of distaste. Why had she given it to the sand? Gaara reached out a hand and picked up the ring. Her fingers were so slender, the shinobi observed as he stroked the cold metal of the band. Why did she act the way she did? So careless, so reckless, so charming and aloof. She reminded him a little of his friend, Uzumaki Naruto, the Konoha shinobi. He too had a carefree nature, but a fierce heart. Gaara had caught a little glimpse of that fire in AI a few days ago. What was it about her that stirred his curiosity? Turning the ring so he could see the stone, he let his thumb brush the light blue gem that shone in his hands. Her soft lips had pushed against the gem in such a delicate, sacrificial manner, as though she were giving up a part of herself to him. Ah! Gaara dropped the ring as though it burned him. It was not only his curiosity that was stirring. At the thought of her, Shikaku was growing restless as though waking to a bloodlust. The Kazekage propped his elbows onto the desk and, with his hands clasped, pushed his lips against his fingers. He closed his eyes, thought for a little while about what he should do, but one thing was clear. He had to be rid of her. The door opened and one of his students, Matsuri, walked in. Gaara-san, there is a girl residing in the palace as a guest. Her name is AI. Bring her to me. Gaara did not open his eyes, so he did not see the look that struck Matsuri's face. The Kazekage had never spoken to her so abruptly, never been so lost in thoughts unknown, never asked for the presence of another woman. Why yes, sir. Matsuri bowed and left the room, leaving Gaara to think quickly about his plan of action. He sat back and squared his shoulders. She was not going to win this time. He placed the ring in the pocket of his shirt and waited. Within moments, there was a knock at the door. The Kazekage took a breath. Enter, he commanded. The door opened and AI appeared as a silhouette at his door before walking into what was left of the sunlight in his office. She had her gaze lowered, her light blue veil placed back neatly on her head, looking innocent and dreamlike. The door shut behind her, and the pair waited in silence. You asked for me, Kazekage? She paused and Gaara took a breath, aware of how he changed in her presence. He felt his commanding nature slipping away, for she stood so defiantly, as though she knew exactly what he had called her for. He stood his ground, keeping a close guard on his emotions. He had not let himself get lost in a storm of emotion in nearly 2 years, and if he failed to maintain a calm nature, he had no idea what Shikaku might do. What happened today? Her electric blue eyes flicked up to him. It seems someone saved me from a lot of trouble. AI smirked. He sighed. What happened with the gardener? It was AI's turn to sigh. She huffed and walked over to the window to watch the sunset, twiddling the end of her veil with her fingers. He had caged 2 songbirds. Hardly a reason to steal. The Kazekage commented, and AI inwardly rolled her eyes. That Kazekage tone, so calm and unyielding, made her want to wake up the Gaara she had heard about. "What did I steal, Kazekage?" She turned to Gaara with a pleading look, her eyes glittering. "Whose right is it to command a bird to fly? To command them to sing?" She walked over to the desk and stood before him. "I gave them back what was taken from them. I gave them freedom." The Kazekage said nothing, and AI shot him a look of impatience. "If you accuse me of doing wrong, then you are condemning yourself." "How so? Was it not you, Kazekage, who saved me from my comeuppance?" She smirked as he remained silent. Not every shinobi in Sunagekure can control sand with such effortless attention. She spoke the last statement in a sultry, girlish manner, but when Gaara looked her straight in the eye, and she seemed to falter. His gaze was merciless. Every glance he gave her seemed to shoot straight through her. "Regardless of my involvement," Gaara spoke in the most diplomatic tone he could master, "you stole from the Kazekage's palace?" He stood from the desk, and AI's face turned to a look of confusion and amusement. Was he about to punish her? Guests have a certain protocol they must follow. What? AI had started to laugh. She put a hand up to her mouth and giggled before regaining her usual manner and appraising the Kazekage. "Coward." Gaara jerked as AI gave him a mocking look of disbelief, the corners of her mouth curling up into a smile. His eyes widened before narrowing on the insolent girl. "What did you say?" Both had dropped their Kazekage and courtesan tones, seeing each other for what they really were, hating each other for their lack of integrity. And suddenly, seduction was forgotten, as was punishment, and it was back to adolescent bickering. "A coward." AI put her hands on her hips and held her head high. "You would rather punish me and be rid of me than really face your fear." AI raised her voice, and Gaara retaliated with equal distaste. "What is it that I am supposed to fear?" he asked her loudly. "The real reason behind why it was you helped me. I helped you to save me the paperwork." "Paperwork?" AI laughed again and looked away from him. "Forgive my insolence, Kazekage, but you are naive even to the ways of your own heart." Gaara walked around his desk and stood opposite her. A growl she had never heard before entered his voice. "How dare why? You're bored." She interrupted with an accusation that seemed to catch the Kazekage off guard. Gaara took a step away from her, the growl in his voice now gone. "What? What is it you do every day besides teach or be taught? Attend meetings or dinners?" AI scoffed. "When are you ever yourself?" His lack of response irritated her, and she raised her voice again. "The only time I ever see you act on your own will is when you are arguing with me." "That's not true." Gaara raised an accusatory finger at her, and AI smiled mockingly. "Oh, sorry," she commented. "Did someone tell you to point at another person in the room, or do you actually have the capacity for self-determination?" Gaara shook his head with a look of utter incomprehension. "Do you even partake in anything remotely ninja-orientated, or has the lure of bureaucracy got the better of you? You are insufferable," he shouted at her. "And you are grateful for the intrusion," she retaliated. "The stars still move, Kazekage, around a greater purpose. They are not stationary. Perhaps if you upheld similar initiative, we would not find ourselves at each other's throats whenever you decide you want to remember what it's like to feel alive." She turned away from him with a shake of her head and walked a few feet away. This Kazekage was nothing more than a 19-year-old shinobi with an overinflated ego. Gaara needed to regain control of the situation. He was growing frustrated with her fallacious accusations. Speaking to her for a moment longer was going to make him boil over. He could feel, in every breath he took, Shikaku's purr as he slept, slowly rising to Gaara's consciousness. He looked across to AI, her back to him, her sky-blue veil hiding her from him. Did she really think he was so meek? "You honestly think I do nothing for myself?" He spoke softly, without thinking, knowing he should end the conversation and tell her to leave the palace for good, but he found he could not tear himself away from her. She turned back as he spoke. His voice was soft. "Do you know how often my counsel falls into pandemonium because they cannot find me?" AI unfolded her arms, a sense of guilt rising in her stomach. "It's true, AI, that I follow the rules and regulations that are befitting of a Kazekage, but it is foolish to think that I follow blindly, that I resign myself to a title." Their eyes met. "Where do you go?" she asked gently. "None of your concern," he replied. She sighed. "No more than an idle lie then." Gaara closed his eyes as she spoke. You are insufferable. And you are unashamedly incarcerated. She turned again and walked to the door. Let us not deny what is happening here, she said as she reached the door. Try as you might. Something has a hold on you. Something that cannot give me up. She turned her head and spoke as though he were right next to her. Call me whenever you wish to feel alive. The courtesan lifted her hand to open the door. Wait, Her hand hovered in the air. What is it, Hokage? Come here. I heard him opening a window and turned to see he had removed the white outer layer of his Hokage uniform to reveal his casual clothes underneath. The long, red, cloak-like shirt and dark trousers. He reached over to his gourd that was placed beside his desk and secured it on his back with a long leather strap. He pushed the window open a little further and looked over to her. Come, he said again, and her face adorned with a look of intrigue, walked over to him. She peered out of the window to see Sasuke becoming sleepy and still in the sunset hours as a cloud of sand began to form before the window. Get on, Gaara instructed her, and, with a sideways glance at him, she lifted her dress, balanced herself on the windowsill, and jumped onto the sand. It was frightening and disorienting, being up so high with nothing but sand beneath your feet. I looked out to the village as lights began to flicker on in homes of civilians, and lanterns lining the pavements were lit. Ah, she gasped as the sand lowered slightly, when the Hokage came to stand beside her on the sand. The quietness of the village, the vast emptiness of the world before them, made all previous frustrations forgotten. Where are we going? I asked and looked up at him. He did not look to her. A place of solitude, he informed her. Where is that? He did not respond as Ai gasped and grabbed his arm when the sand jerked forwards to move. She kept her hand there, maintaining her balance as they began to move off. Eventually the village began to grow smaller in the distance, the lights of homes flickering and glittering as they ascended further into the unknown parts of the world. Ai could not help but smile. What an desert glide past you as you soared through the darkening sky. She held onto the Hokage's arm and looked around them, flitting from one side of the sand to the other, marveling at the world, smiling at the disappearing towns beneath them. All the while Gaara watched her, his eyes never left her face. She was innocent and simple, and that gave him a feeling he had very rarely experienced. It filled him with warmth to watch her smile and point out to places she knew and wanted to know. Her sense of adventure, her love of freedom, spoke to something within him that he never thought he could ever know. Suddenly Ai spun around at the sound of it. Crashing into the earth, the majestic ocean lay before them, dark and spinning. It called to her. As Gaara's sand met the shore, Ai ran out into the night, into the beckoning sea. The horizon twinkled with lights of far-off cities, and it was that time of night, before the moonrise, when the sky is dark but there is enough light of the dying sun to see the beauty of the world around you. The Hokage did not move from where his sand rested but watched the dancer as she kicked off her shoes, lifted her dress, and ran into the sea. Ai may have even been shouting something into the looming darkness. He could not tell as she ran. Upon entering the water, she stopped to let it lap over her feet and soothe her as she tilted her head back to gaze at the stars. The sea was gentle and calm. The only sound was the movement of the waves as they cascaded around her. She turned back to him. Gaara stood watching her, his face calm, his arms folded. In the hours before the moonrise his skin looked as though it were porcelain. She smiled. Gaara was painfully handsome. Everything he did, the way he spoke, the mannerisms he had, his silence, his stare, his gait, his power, his wonderfully defined body, held enough majesty to rival even the ocean. Lifting her dress, she walked out of the water towards him. I watch the sun set here sometimes, Gaara spoke suddenly as she approached. She stood a few feet from him, and for a moment, seemed paralyzed before she began to flit around again. She turned from him, and he watched in silence as she looked around them. But Ai glanced around. Where is the moon? He took a step to stand beside her. I hear she walks the earth now. Her eyes widened as he spoke, and she looked over to him. He stared at her as the world stood still. She was effortlessly endearing, and Gaara could not keep his guard up anymore. He could not understand the look on her face. Was she curious or happy? It seemed to be a mixture of both. She took a step towards him, and he unfolded his arms in surprise. AI noticed him recoil, and slowed down a little. She walked up to him, her eyes never leaving his face, and placed her hands on his chest. AI went up onto the tips of her toes and leant in. She kept her eyes locked with his, feeling the rising and falling of his chest as his breathing deepened. She gave him a last look of reassurance, for he seemed to be scared or nervous, before she closed her eyes and pushed her lips softly to the corner of his mouth. The young Hokage stood with his arms by his side, the tips of his fingers tingling, as a sensation of want began to course through him. The feel of her was unlike anything he had ever known. AI was so soft and gentle. She moved away from him and opened her eyes. He was looking down at her with an expression of nervous excitement. Had he kept his eyes open? And he hadn't pulled her into embrace either. She did not find it humorous but sweet. Did this boy not know how to love? On the shore, at the edge of the world, AI and Gaara stood in twilight, willing the other to show them what they wanted. Close your eyes, AI whispered and leant into his ear. Gaara did as told. Put your hands on me, Gaara. At the sound of this phrase, AI felt Gaara's gentle manner leave them for a moment, as he roughly placed his hands on her hips, before following the contour of her body to her waist. What do you feel? She murmured, and put the arches of her lips against his. The Hokage let out a shuddering breath, and wrapped his arms around her tightly, pulling her into embrace. Alive! He growled before instinct took over and Gaara closed what space there was between their lips, and pushed back against her, with such torturing gentleness, that AI could feel herself succumbing to his charms. As she felt him explore her, feel her, want her, she tried hard to calm the desire rising in her. Unexpectedly, she pushed herself away from him. Gaara opened his eyes, shook his head defiantly, and with a hungry look that made her melt, advanced on her once more. She kept her hand against his chest to stop him moving closer, and Gaara had half a mind to push her arm away, pull her into him again, but the look on her face made him stop. And I looked at him with a small smile, and with almost loving, affectionate eyes. It was a look that would make men follow her to the edge of the earth, and so the Hokage obeyed, wanting to see what the mischievous glint in her eye was foretelling. And I let her hand travel down his chest, as she lowered herself to her knees. Eventually her hand gripped his belt buckle. The sight of her, kneeling, submissive, sacrificial almost, her lips pouting and glistening from their kiss, was waking something up inside of him. He shook his head at her. No, AI, don't kneel. He begged her, wondering what was happening inside of him, what this ocean of emotion was that was flooding him. The girl tilted her head up to him. Why not? She asked, but Gaara's vision was beginning to blur. Something was happening. Something was building up inside of him. I will frighten you. He pleaded with all his will for her to get up, but something was taking over his body, calling out for her. Shikaku was waking up. Frighten me then, she whispered, but Gaara already was losing control. He was being taken over by the bloodlust. Shikaku could smell her sickly sweet perfume. It was filling Gaara's head. The Hokage fell to his knees, and shut his eyes to shut out the vision of her, to try and regain control. Hokage, what's the matter? AI's voice was no longer seductive but panic-stricken. Get away from me, he shouted at her, and put his hands on his ears to rid himself of Shikaku's murmuring. He thrashed his head from side to side, trying to get Shikaku out of his mind, trying to stop AI from getting closer, but the girl was too concerned for him to worry about her safety. She put a hand on the side of Gaara's face, as he thrashed, and tried to calm the panic that was rising inside of her. Gaara! She shouted, for even the ocean started to tumble, and swirl, and swallow them in the roaring sounds of the waves as they thrashed in the night. Sand on the shore began to float up into the air, and spin around them. The world was humming and crashing as the Hokage, on his knees, begged Shikaku to leave him alone, and pleaded with AI to do as he said, and get away from him. In a moment, everything stopped. Gaara stopped moving, the ocean stilled, and the sand floated to the ground again. AI glanced around as everything descended into tranquility. The night breeze seemed to soothe the Hokage who, with his eyes still closed, took a breath. AI placed her hands on either side of his face. Hokage? She asked softly, but she could still sense something was wrong. There was something menacing in the silent way he held himself. "You should have run," Gaara murmured and opened his eyes. AI screamed as fear shook her. The person looking back at her was no longer the Kazekage she knew. She was staring into the eyes of a demon. AI was paralyzed with fear as she knelt before what used to be the Kazekage. His calm green eyes were no longer there. Instead, she found that she could not tear her gaze away from the yellowing, manic eyes that swallowed her whole. The whites of his eyes had turned black as the night around them, and the corner of his lips curved to a smirk. AI could hear the growl, the purr, of Shikaku on the sea breeze. The courtesan was not even aware that she had stopped breathing. Her bottom lip trembled as Gaara raised a hand slowly to place the tips of his fingers on her temple. A bolt of electricity seemed to pass between them as the Kazekage pushed his fingertips against her head so she could feel his nails on her soft, delicate skin. She winced as he dragged his nails from her forehead, down her face, and across her cheek before they found her lips. Gently, watching her skin blush under his touch, Gaara's nails scraped across her lips, letting his thumb pull down her quivering bottom lip to open her mouth. The Biju inside the Kazekage shivered, as did what was left of Gaara, when he saw her lips open for him. She was entirely at his mercy, and it was the fear in her, the innocence, the untouchable beauty, that rendered her unbearably seductive to them both. He placed his fingers beneath her chin and tilted AI's face to his. The dancer complied without hesitation, for it was not only her fear that kept her rooted to the spot. The way he touched her, the way he, Shikaku, looked at her, made her believe she could still feel Gaara in there somewhere, fighting to be heard. Her desire to see him again, the boy she had first kissed, took her over, and she let the monster kiss her. Gaara liked how she did not move. She kept her mouth open as he placed a kiss on her bottom lip. Shikaku shuddered. Her lips were soft, plump and red. He could smell the blood in her. He could taste the fear in the warmth of her mouth. Gaara had kept his eyes open, not out of inexperience, but out of the need to see what he did to her. AI had her eyes closed, and her face held a pained expression, as though denying to herself what she really wanted. He liked it. The Kazekage closed his eyes, placed his hands on either side of her face, and lowered himself onto her once more. There was something so different in the way he kissed. Something fluid, lustful and commanding surged through Gaara, and when he opened his mouth to taste her a little more, AI gasped and, against her will, as though under some spell, began to return the affection. She could feel herself weakening for him as the shinobi ran his tongue along her lips, and AI could hear a deep rumble, a growl, issue from him. He withdrew from their kiss, and they opened their eyes. What Shikaku saw caught him unawares. There was something in her eyes that called out for Gaara. Some emotion he did not understand or know was pulling Gaara out of the darkness. Her big blue eyes were filling up with, was it sadness, grief? Gaara needed to see her, to ask her what that look was, why she looked at him that way. His vision was blurring again. The demon was clawing at his consciousness in a desperate bid to remain in control. The Kazekage swayed as if faint and closed his eyes. Kazekage, AI let out a gasp of relief, for when Gaara opened his eyes again, they were back to those piercing opals that she knew. He took her face in his hands and leant down to rest his forehead against hers, breathing heavily from the effort it took to calm Shikaku down to the depths of his subconscious. AI, he whispered, I cannot keep Shikaku at bay for long. Return to the palace and tell them where I am. I will not leave Waiao. Gaara had grabbed a handful of her hair and pulled so hard her eyes began to water. Her head was being pulled back until she was facing the stars, tears streaming from her glittering eyes. Gaara took a few deep breaths, trying to keep his eyes away from her face. Shikaku was thunderous. Another look at her could mean the end of them both. Do as I say. In an instant, Gaara let go of her hair, and with the other hand summoned the sand beneath her to move. AI was thrown off balance as she brought her head back to face him, but was lifted into the air, and was forced to get onto all fours to look over the edge of the sand that was rising above the earth. Gaara! She held out a hand for him as she was swept away on a cloud of sand and wind, up into the night. AI looked down to him as he became a silhouette on the beach, and could see the Kazekage shouting at his shadow, thrashing on the ground, trying to regain control. She looked around for some way to get to him, but she was already too high. As she glanced from side to side, she saw shadows move across the beach to meet the Kazekage. AI looked on in apprehension until she saw one of the shadows move in a familiar manner, using strings at his fingertips to control what looked like another person. Her heart rate slowed. It was Kankuro, the puppet master. A more careful look and AI could see the other shadows were shinobi. Surely the Kazekage could get Shikaku under control without the need for intervention from the other shinobi? He had managed fine for 2 years. Gaara had lived with the beast for so long. Why now? Was Shikaku restless? As she swept up into the night, her shoulders fell. Gaara and Shikaku were blended together so intricately it was hard to tell where one ended and where one began. Her fingers brushed her lips, and all the way back to the palace her thoughts and wishes for Gaara to be safe, for Shikaku to be controlled, were marred by a more painful question: which one had kissed her? The balconies of the palace were looming up ahead as AI steadied herself on the sand, prepared to jump off at any instant, for she could feel the sand loosening beneath her feet. Its pace was becoming sluggish and jarred. As the Kazekage began to fade away for a demon, his control on the sand also began to weaken. In small trickles, the glittering mass AI was stood on began to crumble. She prepared to fall from the sky as the sand approached the lower floor of the palace, and just as the girl hopped onto the balcony, the sand crashed into the railing and fell into the courtyard. AI glanced from side to side, listening for any commotion. It was the middle of the night. No lights were on in the palace. There was no one around. She spun around to look over the balcony, but the courtyard was empty. After a moment, she turned back to the palace as she heard a door behind her open, and light poured itself into the night. She shielded her eyes, and in the same moment, AI heard shouts from below. They were calling for medic ninja and palace officials. AI! She lowered her arm from in front of her face, and, as her eyes adjusted, she caught sight of Megumi standing in the doorway before her. "Speak, child," the teacher spoke comfortingly. "What is it that has you so afflicted?" But AI could not speak. She could not think. She had to get to him. "Why is your dress wet?" But AI was already running through the palace. They would take Gaara to the sick bay to be monitored, surely. So the courtesan ran. AI, she heard her teacher call after her, but did not turn back. She kept running and twirling and spinning through the palace to find him. AI suddenly found herself stood in a corridor that led to the sick bay. Beyond this point was shinobi territory. It was a world that courtesans sought to control from a distance. Indeed, empires were built on the whispers of courtesans into the ears of enchanted Kage. It was not a world that they were welcomed into so openly. Courtesans were seen in secret, in the reflection of water, in starlight. They never acted on their own will, nor did they actively seek the company of shinobi. AI would defy everything the tea house and the palace stood for if she went through the doors. She took a moment to compose herself, fixing her veil, wiping her eyes. There was no mirror around to see how she really looked, but she found she did not care. The sick bay was located in the basement of the palace, and as she approached the doors tentatively, she saw people rushing in and out, turning on lights, waking up the inhabitants of the palace. AI did not hesitate. She walked straight through the doors leading to the hospital beds. The room was plunged in that fluorescent, unforgiving light, and the sickly smell of hospital disinfectant lingered in the air. The bright white light shone on the busy room. Everyone was too engrossed in the chaos to ask AI what she was doing there. As her eyes scanned the scene, she saw Kankuro stood at the other end of the room, talking to an older shinobi, probably a medic. AI moved forwards, but had to narrowly dodge a group of shinobi carrying scrolls and candles. She glided through the chaotic ward cautiously, unnoticed. The Kazekage has not had to control the Biju with such strength for over a year now. She could hear, as she got closer, what the older man was telling Kankuro. His defenses were down, and something triggered Shikaku to wake Kankuro, and the fellow shinobi broke conversation to look down as someone on the bed beside them stirred. Her eyes caught sight of the hand of the person lying down, and she moved forwards. AI was stopped immediately by someone holding out an arm in front of her. She followed the arm to the body of the person it belonged to. It was the Kazekage's older sister, Temari. The deadly female shinobi had her arms spread out to prevent AI from getting closer. The young courtesan, who would usually have held her veil and lowered her gaze, looked on at Temari defiantly. "You aren't allowed anywhere near him, Oiran, A/N. This is actually the Japanese word for courtesan, but, as keen readers will know, we aren't actually dealing with Japanese courtesans. Temari is using a common word to belittle AI. It is as though she is calling her whore, but has too much pride to even say the word directly." At the sound of his sister's tone, commanding and malicious, Kankuro noticed what was happening in the middle of the room and took a step forwards. AI and Temari did not avert their gaze from one another. Temari, Kankuro came to stand behind his sister, blocking Gaara from AI's view. "What's all this about?" he asked politely. Kankuro, known for being the most easygoing of all the siblings, saw no harm in a courtesan coming into shinobi territory. Temari felt otherwise. A woman can be a shinobi, a mother, a doctor, a friend. When she is none, she is nothing. The blonde shinobi held her head high and kept her arms fanned out. She was with him when it happened. "We can't trust her," Temari said, and gave a small smirk of triumph as AI remained silent. The two women stood there at a deadlock, both acting for different reasons to protect the same man. The room stilled, watching, waiting, knowing that with words AI could cut Temari down in a moment, and with a flick of her wrist Temari could cut AI into nothingness. The dancer and the fighter stood their ground. "What is happening here?" A voice, aged and beautiful, spoke out like birdsong into the room. AI kept her eyes fixed on Temari as Megumi spoke. The elder courtesan arrived in her finery, with other girls of the tea house, to stand with their fellow dancer. "Megumi-san." Kankuro began with closing his eyes, smiling and holding up his hands to signal surrender. "There is no need for such animosity between us." Indeed, Kankuro, Megumi, dressed in silver, white stones, and pearls glistening around her neck and wrists, appraised the young shinobi. "The tea house and the palace have an alliance like no other." She was right. Kankuro knew this. The tea house was the second greatest power in Sunagakure, housing women who knew not only secrets, but how to use them. It was as though two great families were meeting, the courtesans and the members of the palace. Both held significant power in the community, and one could not function without the other. The two sides stood, opposing each other. Temari could sense the power the older woman had, but was not backing down. She stood for the dignity of the palace. She would be damned to see it ruined by the actions of one childish courtesan. Baki, one of Gaara's advisors, and a close friend to the family of the Kazekage, came to stand beside Temari, who was relentless. She held up her arms to prevent AI even seeing the Gaara. Being much older than the Kazekage's family, Baki knew of the alliance the tea house had with the palace and how valuable it was. Wars could be started and ended by just a few whispers from these women. Villages fell to their knees because of the control courtesans had over men of power. It was a relationship that was best not to turn sour. "Baki," Megumi said his name with a voice soft as silk. "We are, all of us, citizens of Sunagakure, are we not?" Baki stood as though to attention. "Yes, ma'am." He turned to Temari. "Temari-sama, please." AI. Everyone jumped as a feeble voice issued from behind Kankuro. After a heartbeat of silence, the puppeteer sighed and took a step back to let the courtesan pass, and Temari, after a moment's hesitation, grudgingly lowered her arms. AI stepped between the two ninja and looked on at their younger brother who lay, eyes closed, brow furrowed, whispering something. Temari looked to the floor, her back to the Kazekage, as everyone else in the room kept their eyes on AI. The dancer paused between the Sand siblings and seemed to be taken aback by the sight of him. Alone and in pain, Gaara whispered her name. AI. Her heart broke, and she ran to him, on her knees, by the bed. She grasped his hand. She felt the room freeze, as though witnessing something blasphemous, as she began to say the Kazekage's first name. "Kazekage?" she corrected herself. Gaara relaxed upon hearing her voice. His body was no longer tense, and his brow no longer furrowed. Slowly, the Kazekage was able to open his eyes. AI swam into his vision, her face worried, biting her lip in suspense, and those big blue eyes. Those eyes with that look. AI felt him tugging away from her, so she released his hand and watched as he raised it to the side of her face. She closed her eyes and smiled into his palm. He felt warm and comforting as he stroked her face, his eyes blinking slowly, as though on the brink of consciousness. Her smile faded quickly, for she opened her eyes to find his hand slipping down her face. AI looked across to him quickly to see that sickly, lustful smile that Shikaku had for her, and within an instant Gaara sat bolt upright, with a hand wrapped around her throat. "Gaara!" Kankuro cried out, as the Kazekage held AI's throat with increasing pressure. The room erupted into chaos as shinobi and medics ran over to AI. In a blur of color and commotion, AI felt Gaara release her throat, and she tumbled backwards. She stood quickly to see the Kazekage writhing as though in pain, whilst another shinobi took out what AI guessed was a sealing scroll. "Get her out of here!" Temari shouted at some ninja, who took AI by the arm and escorted her, dragged her from the room. No, listen to me!" AI screamed and tried to free herself from the shinobi's grip. "He wasn't hurting me." No one was paying her any attention. It didn't hurt him. AI stopped as she caught the look on Megumi's face. The courtesans had all turned to follow her from the room, and her teacher was fuming with anger. AI was forgetting herself, her role, her place, her value. AI quietened and let the shinobi drag her away. She looked past the following entourage of dancer to see Gaara shuddering and muttering in the harsh hospital lighting. AI tried to protest. When Gaara had held her throat, he had not inflicted any pain. She could see in his eyes the battle between Gaara and the beast. He had control. The Kazekage did not hurt her. The ninja let go of AI once she was out of the room, and without thinking she tried to re-enter, but Megumi grabbed her arm. She turned to her teacher. "I have to tell them. Gaara did not cause me any harm. Do not forget yourself, AI," Megumi commanded, and AI, the fire fading from her as she saw the cold, dead look in Megumi's eyes. "You are first and foremost a courtesan of the tea house. Do not treat shinobi as though they are your kin." AI was about to retaliate, but she saw the way everyone outside the room was looking at her. They had eyebrows raised, looks of panic and worry. They were looking at her as though she were mad. AI resigned herself to being taken back to her quarters. An hour or so later, the shinobi of Sunagakure had managed to get the beast under control through the use of a sealing scroll. Those closest to the Kazekage now remained at his bedside: Baki, Kankuro, and a thunderous Temari. Kankuro placed an arm around his sister, who shrugged him away before going to Gaara's side and placing a cloth in a small bowl of water and patting it on his forehead. Her little brother winced under the cold feel of the cloth, and she noticed, as she looked him up and down, that Gaara's hand, clenched into a tight fist, had a small trickle of blood escaping between his fingers. When did he cut himself? How did anything cut through his armor of sand? "Baki," she commanded. "I see it," her teacher replied before going to Gaara's side. The three gathered ninja looked on in curiosity as the eldest lifted the Kazekage's hand to see where the cut was, but it seemed Gaara was clutching onto something in his hand. Without a second thought, Kankuro placed chakra strings on Gaara's fingertips and prized his hand open. Small trickles of blood left the Kazekage's hand to reveal a shimmering blue stone. In fact, it was a ring. Home. It was a word AI had no use for she never knew home. Orphaned at a young age and adopted by the tea house, hundreds of women became her mother, for moments, for days, never forever. She was raised in these glass walls. On these marble floors she learned how to walk, how to dance, how to seduce with her gait. Within these rooms, she had learned how to talk, how to recite poetry, how to sing like the skylark. Everything she was because of this place, the tea house. It defined her, and it was, as much as she could not understand the term, home. She even had her own room here, her own fountain room, her own balcony. Was any of it hers? Did anything really belong to her? Clothes, jewelry, books that she had been given all disappeared when they had served their purpose. She never wore the same dress twice, nor the same gems, and she never needed to read a book twice. As a commodity herself, as an object of value, to be exchanged and sold, How could she ever own anything? The young courtesan sat now on her swing that hung in her balcony, knees drawn up to her chest, dressed in a simple white nightshirt that came to just above her knees with plain silver anklets tied to her feet, for she could not be without them. She had not worn a veil on her head in days. What was the need? No makeup, which was unusual practice considering that at the palace she had had to wear it every day. But she was not at the palace. She was back, alone and silent, on her swing, letting the breeze of Sunagakure gently rock her back and forth in the light of the sunrise. The heat of the desert was filling the air around her, but it felt so far away. Ever since leaving the palace, everything she experienced seemed distant. Conversation sounded like the last echo in a valley. Color faded and surrendered to monochrome. Emotions, once a deep ocean of swirling chaos, now felt like the irritating drip of a tap in a nearby room. Miko, her friend, along with other girls of the tea house, had come to her room yesterday evening and, in an attempt to alleviate her melancholy, they had steamed her hair with fragrance of the jasmine flower. She could smell it now, the blossom jasmine on the wind, and she frowned with remembrance. The dancers had sat AI at her ancient, glass dressing table and ran a brush through her long silken hair. They had talked and sang around her as she remained quiet, staring into nothingness. She had not even noticed Miko kiss her head and say goodnight, or the other girls giggle and ask her how Gaara was as a lover. At the thought of him, AI shut her eyes tightly. She wanted to be rid of him. That wretched boy. He had a hold on her like none she had ever known. AI could think of nothing but the beauty of his face, the caress of his voice, the lick of heat that flickered inside of her when they had kissed. "No!" she shouted, held her legs tight to her chest, and buried her face into her knees. "Leave me alone," she whispered as she rocked. "Leave me alone." Days without him were long. They had passed with moonless nights, and she had survived through them on heavy sighs. What had happened that night? The night she kissed the Hokage had exhausted and terrified her. The girl was put through severe emotional and physical stress, more than her sensei had anticipated, and so, in what Megumi thought was an act of kindness, she had forbidden AI from entering the palace, and from seeing the Hokage again. Megumi had no idea what was going on inside the girl's head, for even AI could not understand it. She tore at Gaara when he was around her, like a child pinching and pulling at the hair of another. She teased him, and complained about him, and challenged him. So why on earth had AI taken their separation with such vivacious heartbreak? One moment AI was screaming not to be in the same room as the young Hokage, and the next moment she was screaming at those who pulled them apart. Teacher and student had not spoken in days because of this, because of what happened that night. Flashback. The moments following AI being escorted out of the sickbay. The ninja let go of AI once she was out of the room and, without thinking, she tried to re-enter, but Megumi grabbed her arm. She turned to her teacher. "I have to tell them that the Hokage did not cause me any harm. Do not forget yourself, AI." Megumi commanded and spoke louder when AI opened her mouth to retaliate. "You are first and foremost a courtesan of the tea house. Do not treat shinobi as though they are your kin." Megumi knew AI held nothing but disdain for authority that was grounded simply in tradition. The regulations put in place by the treatise between the courtesans and the shinobi were meaningless to her. Like a sea of endless commands and rules, AI felt swallowed by her ties to the courtesans. She lowered her gaze to the floor and began breathing heavily. "AI?" Megumi spoke with all the authority an elder courtesan had. Slowly, AI raised her head to face her teacher. Her usually serene and delicate face was screwed up in frustration, and her eyes flashed red. She opened her mouth to speak, but as she glanced around, she saw the way everyone outside the room was looking at her. They had eyebrows raised, looks of panic and worry. They were looking at her as though she were mad. "Take a moment, my dear." Megumi spoke softly and put a hand on AI's shoulder. AI, still frustrated, looked back at the older woman in alarm. Why had she suddenly changed her tone? "Close your eyes, take a breath," her teacher instructed, and AI rolled her eyes. Megumi's old trick for making her calm down. Her sensei would often employ this tactic when AI was a child and began to throw tantrums. It usually worked, but as a result, AI's childhood temper was soon replaced by a bad habit of talking back. In spite of her indignation, AI complied begrudgingly, if only to make the stare stop. As her eyes closed, she could already feel herself calming down. The anger of being parted from him began to ebb away, and her breathing became shallower. "Come, girls," she heard Megumi say, and AI stood in line with her fellow dancers and began to walk with them. Their anklets tinkled in unison as they walked, in line, in perfect time, like an army, through the palace. There were whispers and giggles spinning around AI, but she could not hear them nor respond to them. Her mind was alive with thoughts of him, and the demon, and the tension she had created between courtesan and shinobi. She knew she was to pay a dear price for what she had done. AI had stepped into a world unknown with blind faith that they would see nothing wrong in her actions. She saw no sense in what anyone older than her did. She was trying to protect the Hokage, and instead they treated her as though she were nothing. Such was the life of a courtesan. Such was her life. "Leave us." AI, who had been so lost in her thoughts, looked up suddenly to find that Megumi had brought them all into what looked like a library. Oil lamps offered dim light to see the rows of books and scrolls that littered desks. The other girls around AI, including her friend Miko, disappeared as quickly as shadows drowned in candlelight. A strong wind howled in the distance, shaking the shutters of the windows in the library. The oil lamps flickered and glittered as AI glanced around the room in a haze of tired confusion, waiting for the inevitable scolding. Megumi took a few steps to the middle of the room and turned to her student. "Before I ask you to inform me of what happened on the shore, I will warn you, AI, do not forget the value you owe to the tea house. Do not forget that you are a courtesan. If you wish to be a whore, I will happily find you a brothel to retreat to." Startled, AI shook her head and took a step forwards. "A whore?" She tilted her head in confusion. "I haven't even slept with him." "Haven't?" Megumi interrupted as AI stood, completely dumbfounded about what was happening here. Apostrophes are reserved for the layman, AI. Her teacher spat out the words as though they were venom. Punctuation that breaks up prose is the language of whores. AI actually smiled at hearing this, a sick smile of utter disbelief. "Apostrophes?" AI breathed. "The Hokage is in pain because of me." She pointed to the door, back in the direction of the hospital, and shook her head. "Why were elders so shamelessly petty? Gaara is hurting. And yet, you wish to give me a lesson in punctuation?" The two women stood opposite each other. The bond they had taken years to nurture was now bending, ready to snap, for they could not understand one another. Both were blinded, the elder by power, societal recognition and culture, whilst AI, well, even she was not sure what it was that had a hold on her. Upon hearing her speak, Megumi almost retreated into herself. She lowered her voice and raised an eyebrow. In a whisper, she voiced a fear. "What is he to you besides financial and social stability?" As Megumi spoke, AI grew tired of her old-fashioned attitude and stood to her full height. "He is a human being," she cried. "AI?" Megumi stopped her student with a single utterance of her name, as the harsh winds of the desert shattered against the windows. Fish in dark waters can have no relationship with birds in bright skies. Megumi stood forwards, glittering in silver and diamonds. AI did not back down. Her eyes shone with tears of frustration. "And yet our planet has some relation to stars. Men have some relation to gods. That is not how women of the tea house are raised. Then perhaps it is time for revolt." And with the last word, AI ran from her teacher for the second time that night. She turned on her heel, pushed the doors of the library open, and ran out into the palace. AI ran to the palace entrance and looked around for some means of escape. She heard it before she saw it, the shuffling of hooves, and her eyes narrowed on a carriage that had drawn up outside the palace gates. She walked over hurriedly, glancing up at the sky where the stars were fading to give way to the daytime. Her frustration did not care for the cold that Sasuke felt before the dawn. She marched onto the carriage and approached the driver, a stout man who stood to attention, instantly recognizing her as a tea house dancer. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked, and she stole a quick glance back at the palace steps to see Megumi walk out and stop to watch her. AI turned back to the driver. "The tea house," she instructed, and went to the doors of the carriage. "Payment?" His question called her back, and she turned to him. Holding up her wrist, AI removed a single gold bangle. "Here?" she muttered absent-mindedly, and threw it to him. "It is pure gold." She was about to turn away when a hand that did not belong to the driver caught her bangle as it shot through the air. A man, perhaps a few years older than herself, walked out into the first light of the day and appraised her. AI shot him a quick glance and knew him immediately. Chiseled features, dark hair and eyes, dressed as though ready for a banquet, he was royalty. His eyes were a dark shade of blue, and AI took a fraction of a step back as they looked her up and down. "Payment is not necessary," he spoke in a husky, tired voice. He had clearly traveled a long while to get to the palace in the middle of the night. "This is my carriage," he informed her, and AI, feeling slightly sheepish that her frustration had blinded her to the point of stealing from the royal, cast her eyes downwards in respect and bowed. "You may take it wherever you please." AI raised herself up again and let her eyes flick up to him in the last moment. She knew his stare, that hungry, powerful glance that men of royalty have. "Perhaps your bangle would be best traded for shoes." Cursing herself, AI realized she had left her shoes on the beach and tried to regain some of the power in the conversation. "Perhaps, Prince, your gaze could wander elsewhere?" she said sweetly, but with a look that could kill. The man took a few steps forward and smiled. He could see that she was intimidated. AI felt vulnerable. She did not have her usual flawless appearance. She was not wearing shoes. She had her guard down. The usually quick-witted courtesan was not prepared for a battle of words after the night she had had. He came close to her and held up her bangle for her to retrieve. "Forgive the trespasses of my eyes, dear one," he whispered. "They are but slaves to your beauty." AI was at a loss for words. He was charming. Her world had been thrown into such chaos in these few hours that she had forgotten the pleasure of flirtation. His rugged features, those dark eyes, made her forget her reason for leaving the palace, but slowly, she raised a hand to take her bangle back. He leant in a little further, and saw the way the girl's eyes glazed over dreamily, as he whispered, "Payment is taken in the glances I may steal at you." He moved back, and AI retreated with a small smile. A servant opened the carriage door, and she took a step towards it. With a nod of her head, she thanked him. "Good night, Prince." The boy, who was indeed a prince, kept his eyes locked on her as she got into his carriage. The servant was about to close the door, but the prince commanded him to leave, and instead shut the door behind AI for her. He looked up at that blue-eyed girl as though she fascinated him. He had never seen anyone so entirely lovely in all his life. Their eyes did not part from one another. "Until we meet again," he said, and the carriage moved off. He stood, watching, and did not even turn as he heard the footsteps of someone approach him. "How is it moonlight walks the earth, Megumi-sama?" he asked dreamily. Megumi looked to him and shook her head. "No, Prince, there walks vanity." End flashback, AI's room. AI's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her door. "The palace? You called for me, Gaara-sama?" Looking up, the Kazekage saw Matsuri pop her head around his office door, with a look of concern. He inwardly groaned. That pathetic look of pity had been haunting him for days. His family and close friends had taken to tilting their heads at him in worry following him losing control at the beach. How tiresome. "Yes, come in and sit down," he spoke sternly, remembering the days when losing control meant people would cower in fear. That's how Gaara preferred things. None of this mollycoddling or safeguarding existed when he let himself fall under Shikaku's will. "I wish to talk with you." "To talk?" Matsuri murmured uncertainly, and went to sit down in front of his desk. "With me?" She sat upright, her hands on her knees, her cheeks pink. She glanced up at him quickly and blushed furiously. The young Kazekage had a rogue-like reputation among her class. Handsome and talented, Gaara unknowingly left a trail of broken hearts, as he showed no interest in any of them. "Yes," Matsuri leant forwards in interest. The Kazekage was known for being a very reserved, contemplative young shinobi. An invitation to conversation was the last thing she had expected. Gaara looked her up and down, wondering if he dared speak what was on his mind. She was his first student, and the closest stranger he had ever known. one of the first people to acknowledge him as anything but a monster. He trusted her. Gaara lifted a hand to the papers on his desk and Matsuri raised an eyebrow at him, as he looked like he was simply reading them. Eventually the Kazekage began to fiddle with the corner of the paper, and she could see, from the way his back stiffened and the furrow in his brow, that he was regretting his decision to speak with her. But why? What thoughts had he been so lost in these few days? His student was on the edge of her seat, begging to know. How do you feel? Matsuri leant in further, for her teacher was speaking barely above a whisper. When I look at you. The young girl jerked in surprise, as those shockingly blue eyes flashed up at her intently. Her eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no sound issued from her. The Kazekage leant forwards, noticing her abrupt reaction. Are you alright? Matsuri nodded slowly, barely blinking. Would you like some water? She nodded again, as Gaara indicated with a nod to the glass on his desk. Matsuri reached out and grabbed the glass with both of her hands for fear that under his merciless gaze she would become weak. Gaara sat in silence for a full minute as Matsuri drained the glass in one gulp, as though trying to decrease her body temperature. Why was it, whenever he spoke to these girls, they would act as though they had never spoken to anyone in their entire lives? It was infuriating. The Kazekage knew full well that a few of his students found him attractive, but their behavior truly baffled him sometimes. Could you just, Matsuri began after a few deep breaths, ask me that again? Perhaps she had misheard. How do you feel when I look at you? The Kazekage asked again, and with a little more of a growl in his voice. I feel. She glanced up at him and turned red before looking into the glass in her hands, my heart stopping. Matsuri gave a small smile and pushed her hair behind her ear. Gaara nodded slowly. How do you feel when I speak with you? As the Kazekage asked her this, the girl looked up with a broad smile. Honored Gaara-sama. Do you fear me? Gaara stood from his desk quickly and Matsuri looked up at him with eyes full of sadness. How could she ever fear him? No, she said defiantly with a shake of her head. As Gaara walked towards her, he saw her shift backwards in her seat, as though terrified that he was coming closer to her. Would you ever dare challenge me? He asked and came to stand beside her. Matsuri turned her head to him. Never. She looked up at him and gulped. He was eyeing her with curiosity, with an interest he had never shown in her before. Her eyes glassed over as he leant down to her. Matsuri? Yes? Was she speaking? She didn't know. She could barely feel anything anymore given that the Kazekage was mere inches from her face. How do you feel when I touch you? Gaara put a hand to the side of her face and watched as Matsuri's glazed over expression became redder and redder, until, Gaara-sama, the shrill squeal that issued from Matsuri made even Shikaku wake up and cover his ears in annoyance. Gaara stood bolt upright and covered his ears with his hands, watching as Matsuri jumped up to him, clasped her hands in front of her and closed her eyes. You're my teacher. It would be so forbidden. I was only asking a question. Gaara proceeded to fold his arms, but his utterance went unnoticed by Matsuri, who stood on shaking legs and slowly backed away to the door. No, 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 she muttered. This is a dream. This cannot be real. I don't even have any makeup on. Matsuri, but upon hearing the Kazekage say her name, she squealed again, opened his office door, and ran out. Gaara stood, dumbfounded, completely in the dark about what insanity had just occurred, as his brother and sister walked in. Both his siblings raised eyebrows at Matsuri as she ran past them. You know, if scaring girls were part of the job description for being a Kazekage, you would be doing very well, little brother. Kankuro smiled as he walked into the room. Temari followed, shaking her head. Gaara, she spoke softly, placing her hands on her hips. The council wants you to know that the welcoming banquet for the royal is tonight. Her younger brother nodded as he took a seat at his desk. And the tea house has been invited as per Baki's request, she said through gritted teeth. She watched her brother, aware of how he changed when she said this. Gaara had leant forward to inspect some work, but upon hearing this news he clasped his hands together and sat as though in deep contemplation. We must maintain adequate relations with them. The tea house knows too much for us to estrange them. He nodded, and Temari, who looked like she wanted to say more, stopped herself and showed herself out. Kankuro went to follow her, and before he shut the door, he cocked his head back to Gaara. "I will be there." Either the Kazekage did not hear, or did not acknowledge what Kankuro had said, for Gaara kept his gaze lowered, as though he had gone back to work. Kankuro sighed. What a strange and twisting relationship Gaara and AI had. One moment, they were at each other's throats, the next they became misery when pulled apart. He followed Temari into the hallway. Kankuro had heard from other courtesans around the dinner table, as they clung to the arms of his brother's counsel, about how AI had shut herself away upon being told she was not allowed near the young Kazekage. They had such a hold over one another, and Ikuro could not help but think that, as was inevitable with Gaara, they were all witnessing a love story that would inevitably end in tragedy. Death followed Gaara like a shadow, and Kankuro could not bear the thought of his brother falling for someone, only to have it end in heartbreak. Back in the Kazekage's office, an aquamarine was catching the light of an afternoon sun. Twirling it around in his fingers, Gaara was spirited away to his last moments with her. In truth, the last thing he could remember was her kneeling before him, ready to do something near sinful. It flooded him with an emotion unlike any he knew. It was almost as though he wanted to feel her shudder and writhe at his mercy, like his enemies years ago. The Kazekage's brow furrowed. No, it wasn't like that dark murderous intent he felt back then. It was different. But how? Gaara could not name it, but he knew one thing. He wanted her. He thought back to barely a few moments ago, when Matsuri had been in the room. Gaara knew she wanted him. She had made it clear many times through her blushing and barely suppressed, overly enthusiastic support for him as Kazekage. Gaara may come across distant, disinterested, and, some had said, naive, but he wasn't an idiot. He knew Matsuri was a girl, willing to do anything and everything for him. But when he looked at her, it was not the same. He had asked her how she felt when the Kazekage looked at her. Matsuri had said that her heart stopped. Did he do that to AI? He could not tell. When he spoke to AI, he almost smiled at the thought of it. She looked disinterested, as though she had better things to do. AI was mischievous, and, was the word flirtatious? She knew exactly what to do to irritate him, to stir his curiosity, to make him die in the heat of want. Matsuri did not fear him either. Was she mad? The Kazekage had the power to kill her without even moving. AI, on the other hand, had the smirk wiped from her face out of fearing him. It was delicious, irresistible to him, to the old Gaara, the younger, more devilish, bloodthirsty Gaara, who had not emerged for years. She brought out that side of him when she merely bit her bottom lip in worry of what he might do to her. His student had also said that she would never challenge him. He sighed. All his relationship was with AI was an irritating battle of wits. The girl practically reveled in unnerving him, as though she were designed solely to rile him. She recited riddles and poetry and quips and rhetoric full of nothing but torment for him. How did AI feel when he touched her? The part of Gaara that was waking up, the part hungry for her, was dying to know this. To hear from her lips a gasp, a sigh of gratification. To see her beautiful face screw up in pain and frustration and beg for him was all he wanted. That moonlight girl had a hold of him, and the Kazekage knew it. He even knew that word that explained this dark, sinful feeling. Lust. AI stood from her swing quickly and, as she approached her desk, she blew out a few candles that had lent her light to study in the nighttime. As with every object in the tea house, her writing desk was not as it really seemed, for she lifted up the tabletop to reveal a hidden compartment underneath. The desk was aged and enchanting, a pale wood painted white which was now chipping and fading. But the hidden compartment was clean and well kept, for AI had made good use of it over the years. With a quick glance over her shoulder to make sure there were no prying eyes, she reached out for some books on her shelf that she had stolen from Megumi's private library. AI placed them in the hidden compartment quickly and shut the unconventional lid to her desk. As she crossed her room, the cold sunshine of the morning was beginning to creep in. The mornings at the tea house had always seemed slightly gray and dull, for the place truly became alive in the nighttime. Unlike the palace, this place reveled in chaos when the sun set, for now it seemed empty and asleep. It seemed to fit her mood perfectly. Upon approaching the door, AI looked over to her mirror. She wiped her eyes hurriedly and tied up her hair in a loose ponytail before opening the door slowly. She had only opened it a few inches before a hand began to sneak its way through the crack. It was holding onto a porcelain mug. A peace offering, warm milk and honey. It was your favorite. A voice spoke softly and, despite herself, AI walked away. She left the door ajar in an attempt to be as welcoming as she felt, and went to sit on her bed. Megumi walked in, revealing that the hand with the mug belonged to her. AI Sensei looked forlorn. Still not speaking to me? AI avoided Megumi's gaze and looked down to her crocheted blanket. The girl began fiddling with a hole she had made when she tore the blanket in her childhood, picking at the soft cream yarn with her delicate fingers. Megumi went to stand in front of her. Will you at least drink something? Megumi held out the mug, and AI, knowing that at this stage she was only being childish, took it gratefully but remained in stubborn silence. Her teacher took this to mean that they had reached some common ground, and so sat down next to her student. What is it that has you so afflicted, dear one? Her teacher reached over and brushed hair from her face as AI took a sip of the warm drink. The same question over and over for days. Even after they had argued, upon re-entering the tea house, into the early morning, Megumi had forbidden AI from meeting with the Kazekage for the foreseeable future. It was dangerous for the both of them. The blue-eyed dancer had refused to accept this, and she was not likely to back down anytime soon. A few moments of silence passed before Megumi sighed. It seems our chirping skylark has left us for a mute. The elder courtesan reached down to the floor and picked up 2 small boxes that AI had not noticed. Perhaps she will grant us one last exchange upon seeing her gifts. AI, out of curiosity more than materialism, looked up at her sensei with a wry smile as Megumi gestured to 2 packages in her lap, beautifully wrapped in ivory paper and tied with a silver ribbon. She handed the smallest one to AI. AI took the package and eyed it with scrutiny before delicately pulling back the ribbon and deviling into the small silver box that was revealed as the ivory paper fell away. Flicking the lid of the box open, she peered inside. Her eyes flashed as she looked up at Megumi with a large smile and moved forwards to embrace her teacher, who laughed heartily. I am glad you approve. Megumi smiled and stroked her student's hair. Wear it proudly, she whispered as AI pulled away from her, beaming. I shall. The young dancer said happily and removed, from the antique box, a small silver band, the middle of which housed a single diamond. It was an armlet. In the courtesan community, a teacher presented her student with her first armlet following her recognition as an established dancer. It was true that AI was yet to seduce anyone, but her skills were unmatched, and so, to Megumi, it only seemed right. As AI would become more experienced, her lovers, her customers, would add diamonds and further bands to the armlet, and it was this that showed the ranking of a courtesan. Megumi wore 7 thin bands on her left arm, tied with a single ribbon, diamonds in each band, shining and glittering, showing to the world her skill. The other? AI looked to the other, larger gift in Megumi's lap and, with a gasp of remembrance, Megumi handed her the box. It arrived this morning, the older courtesan said, nonchalantly, and AI, placing her armlet on the bed beside her, took the box and opened it. A small cream-colored card fell into her lap, and she picked it up to read an inscription, written in black ink, in filigree-like handwriting. Perhaps a gold bangle would suffice as payment? AI put the card down with a frown and looked into the box. She removed a pair of silk shoes, and a wave of recognition passed over her. From the prince? She asked and looked up to Megumi, who smiled. You have not even danced for him, and yet he sends you gifts, she laughed. If only I had been so talented in my youth. AI smiled down at the shoes. Silver silk with embroidery of silver thread. Had she managed to make such an impression in 2 minutes of meeting? AI, she looked up as Megumi spoke in a serious tone. The palace is holding a banquet for the young prince tonight. They have requested a dancer in honor. Of course I will. AI spoke sharply and stood from the bed. With her back to her teacher, she began to stretch. Megumi stood too and shook her head. Whilst I am pleased that you have regained your usual spirit, I am afraid that I cannot allow. This is ridiculous. AI turned to her. I am the first courtesan to the Kaze. It is too dangerous for you. Megumi pleaded, but AI placed her hands on her hips and stood defiantly. Under whose judgment? She frowned. Under mine, my child. I cannot see you be put through so much stress again. Her teacher answered, but it was not good enough for a girl as stubborn as AI. I can speak for mice. AI's voice trailed away, and her head turned to the direction of her open door. The first dance practice of the morning were beginning, and she could hear the musicians striking their harps to familiar chords. The notes floated in on the morning breeze. Is that Dash? After a moment of barely thinking, AI ran from her room. AI! Megumi shouted after her and rolled her eyes. This girl was running nowadays more than she was dancing. The tea house was once the pride of Sunagakure. It was built by an aristocrat who grew fat and greedy and spent his money on cheap whores and alcohol until he succumbed to eating himself to his grave. He had built it as a testament to his own legend. As a collector of fine and beautiful things, the tea house was filled with items from all over the world. With architecture common to the desert interspersed with more Western decoration, the aristocrats spared no expensive, and even had the audacity to cheat the dessert by placing a large fountain in the courtyard. In his will, he left the house to his concubines who saw no reason to stop working, and over time, the class of prostitute reached its highest possibility, and courtesans now inhabited the place. It was a building of ancient grandeur, with all objects and infrastructure now mere whispers of how grand the place was. The only rooms kept in the best condition were those seen by customers. There was no need for Megumi to spend more than necessary on maintaining the place. Even the courtyard that held morning dance practices now looked like the ruin of a castle, with gray stone arches crumbling and being overtaken by roses climbing their way into the cracks. The tea house was a jumble, a war between stone and glass, with beautiful relics aging in every corner, and AI ran through it all, barely noticing the shouts of people calling for her to stop. AI entered the courtyard to the shock of those gathered, and did not blink twice as they gestured to her in alarm. She did not care for their whispers. Her eyes narrowed on the musicians, who avoided her gaze, so she looked for the dancer, who was practicing that morning. Many dancers fluttered in and out of the courtyard, looking like tropical birds, for the bright colors they wore stood out against the gray stone that surrounded them. Only one girl was stood in the center, preparing to dance. Miko, a dancer with green eyes and chocolate brown hair, AI's oldest and closet friend, turned upon hearing the hurried footsteps to face AI. Miko's eyes widened as she realized the poorly dressed individual was her friend, for it was a very rare sight where a courtesan was in anything other than her finery. AI, are you feeling bad? What are you doing? AI interrupted. Miko's smile faded. It was incredibly out of character for AI to be so aggressive. Whatever do you mean? In the chill of the morning, those gathered in the courtyard shivered upon hearing Miko's dangerous tone. A few dancers even shuffled back. I wrote this song, AI responded as Miko took a few cautious steps towards her. A thin smile spread over Miko's face. I will be performing at the palace tonight, and we did not want such a beautiful song to go unsung. Then I will sing it. AI snapped as Miko let out an airy laugh as though shooing away the idea. Megumi-sama has instructed me. I will sing it, AI repeated. The two friends stared at each other a moment longer before Miko's look of surprise was replaced by something AI had never seen before. The green-eyed girl slinked over to AI and shook her head. The Kazekage has cast quite a spell on you, hasn't he? Miko whispered and flicked her eyes over to the crumbling arches behind AI to see Megumi stood, watching the quarrel, wondering how far AI would go for him. Whatever do you mean? AI asked with a sickly sweet smile. One moment, you are completely passive, letting the waves of the day wash over you as we all try to coax our moon down from the night. And yet, Miko took a step toward AI. You caused such a storm at the thought of another girl dancing for him. AI remained silent. Miko had no idea what she was up against. The blue-eyed dancer knew what her friend was doing. She was trying to get a rise out of her so Megumi would see that AI was still emotionally vulnerable when it came to Gaara. If this happened, Megumi would replace AI, out of the need to protect her, with the next best dancer. That was undoubtedly Miko, and AI was determined not to let him get away. She had to see him. AI was being flooded by an overwhelming and incomprehensible feeling that she was trying to deny. She needed him. "Well, I can see you are as stubborn as ever, AI," Miko said cheerfully, and closed her eyes with a smile to signal surrender. "Of course I would never get in your way." She gestured to the center of the courtyard. "Please, begin your practice. You have not danced for a few days." AI smiled at her as Miko walked past her to go out of the courtyard, but as they became level, the look in each other's eye was far from friendly. Upon entering the archways, Miko went to stand with Megumi, and both watched as AI began to instruct the musicians, and called one of the younger dancers out to assist her. In the half-lit darkness of the arches, Megumi and Miko exchanged a glance. "Why are things playing out this way, sensei?" Miko asked innocently, and pouted as Megumi did not respond. "Why is she the one? It has to be her." Megumi responded wisely. The teacher of courtesans contemplated a moment, wondering how much to tell Miko. Megumi was playing a dangerous game. The pieces of the chess board had been put in place 19 years ago, and she was simply taking the first move. The rest was up to AI and Gaara, but how much should she give away to AI's rival? What would be the benefit in hinting at the plan that was slowly revealing itself to the world? "There is more to AI than you know, Miko. More than even she understands." Megumi spoke softly, delicately, daring Miko to ask more. The girl fell for her teacher's ruse. "But why did you make me pretend to take over her dance? And why did you forbid her from seeing the Kazekage, only to give in a few days later?" Miko crossed her arms in annoyance, and blew a straying strand of hair from her face. "Because now?" Megumi sighed and placed a hand on the wall next to her, looking out to AI. "She will pour her soul into every note." "But why is it so important that AI be the one to dance for the Kazekage? It is written in her destiny." "How so?" "You remember the story I told you as a child?" Megumi spoke with a small smile. "Ketsueki AI no Dendetsu, the legend of the blood love?" Miko took a moment to think before it registered with her. "The story between the gods?" As Miko spoke in barely a whisper, Megumi nodded. "The love capable of starting or ending all wars." The elder woman sighed, and looked to the crumbling stone that she was leaning against. The arch had carvings of flowers, fading and crumbling away, giving way to the real roses that were pushing their way through the cracks towards the light. Such a delicate shade of pink. The roses unfurled and cowered in the breeze of the desert. "It is their story. I am sure of it," Megumi said with a small smile. Miko looked out at AI, who was bossing her entourage of dancers around, and raised an eyebrow. "How can you be so sure? Her father forewarned me." As Megumi said this, Miko's eyes widened. Her father? Dinner was passing him by. The Kazekage sat with his council, siblings, and royal guests in the hall, where auspicious dinners usually took place. His Kazekage had hung on the back of his chair, as Gaara suffocated in the traditional robes that he had grown to hate. His back straight, his hand stretched out, holding the small clay cup of sake that had been poured for him. Gaara lowered his head slightly, and Temari, who was sat on his right, could sense the dark clouds that were around him. The Kazekage's mind seemed to be elsewhere, for he took no notice of the jubilant hubbub that surrounded him. He stole a glance at the clock. The hand that counted down the minutes seemed to be moving tortuously slowly. It was almost 9 o'clock. It was almost time. "Kazekage," a voice brought him out of his thoughts, and he looked to his left to see Prince Nobutara smiling at him with that welcoming, open manner that the prince had mastered. "You have become not only the youngest Kazekage in history, but also the youngest Kage the world has ever known." Gaara nodded his head in thanks to Nobu's words. "Tell me, how did you manage such a feat?" The prince spoke with such ease at these gatherings. Gaara had been kept away from such things for so long that he found it difficult to be as at ease as the prince was. It was the hardest part about being a Kage, in Gaara's opinion. The social, public side of things was complicated and new to him. Nobutara was handsome and charming. He was almost the exact opposite to Gaara, who remained quiet most of the time, isolated, unwilling to make himself known for fear of being shunned. Temari watched her brother eagerly. Over the space of only a few months, she had seen Gaara change and shift to become the Kage that sat before her. The bloodlust was gone, replaced by the desire to be recognized by his village and those who once feared him. Gaara was calm and contemplative. Not of late, granted, not since she came into his life. That girl was slowly unraveling what had taken years to tie up. AI was a bizarre conundrum. Gaara seemed to come back to life when she was near and his siblings saw him happy for a few moments. The problem was Gaara seemed to come back to life when she was near. Temari sighed and looked up quickly as Gaara opened his mouth to speak. With a lot of determination, Nobutara-san, Gaara spoke in the usual soft manner, aware that all eyes were on him. Sunagakure became lost in the shinobi world, marred by lies and violence. It is my goal to re-establish our village and regain the honor we have forgotten. Gaara's words were met with a murmur of approval. Spoken like a true Kage, Baki said, and raised his glass to the Kazekage. Others around the table followed. Gaara felt more at ease, so he was getting better at this. Shall we retire to the courtyard? Kankuro suggested cheerfully, much to the annoyance of Temari, who shot him a look to silence him, but it was too late. The puppet master grinned at his sister apologetically as everyone around the table stood upon seeing the Kazekage stand. Dinner was over. Temari remained in her seat, her lips pursed. The dancer from the tea house was said to be ready for 9 o'clock, and, as the blonde looked up at the clock, she saw the clock strike 9. The guests all left the table smiling and talking happily, excited to see what the tea house, which had a reputation like royalty, had to offer. Temari stood eventually, as a group of women walked by her, and she joined their group with a flace smile. At least I was not dancing. The performance was to take place in a stone courtyard that was situated in the back, private quarters of the palace. White stone arches lined the courtyard, which was left open and empty for occasions such as this. The arches housed the seating for the royals and shinobi that would watch. The white stone glittered in the candlelight, which was flickering and teasing fireflies as they dared to get too close. White birds that inhabited the courtyard fluttered away as they heard approaching footsteps. Prince Nobutara entered the courtyard behind the Kazekage and looked up at the night sky that the desert had to offer. He frowned. No moon again tonight. Other than that, the palace was quite beautiful. Strange that a Kage should have such a splendid home, considering he was merely a shinobi, not of noble or royal blood. But Sunagakure did have one of the earliest established dynasties in the world. Perhaps the palace was simply a testament to the nobility of old. Everyone went to take their seats on cushions surrounding the clearing in the courtyard, all hidden in the shade of the arches, waiting with bated breath to see who was coming to sing for them that night. The Kazekage and the prince sat beside on another, the San siblings beside their brother, members of the royal house by their prince. Musicians entered the courtyard and sat opposite the gathered guests, followed by courtesans who bowed and took seats behind the musicians. It began with the tinkling of anklets. Gaara closed his eyes. That sound, it called out for him, but she was not there. Where was she? He opened his eyes and could see the bright colors that the tea house women wore, but he could not see one that looked like her. None shone like AI did. None bit their lip in that seductive, mischievous manner that she did. Perhaps she had not come. Perhaps, like always, he had scared someone away. Why did they run from him? At the thought of this lonesome and overbearing inevitability, Gaara bowed his head as something in his chest constricted and twisted in pain. Would he ever see her again? That skylark? That teasing summer breeze? Did she hate him? Did she long for him like he did for her? Did she think about him at all? He had never got to ask her, had he, what that feeling was that showed in her eyes when she kissed him. On the desert plains there sat love. Gaara looked up at the sound of her name and saw, whilst he had been lost in his thoughts, that the performance had begun. The dancer in front of them, who had her head bowed, had an entourage of women behind her. Their voices stretched out into the night for him. Alone and peaceful, in the calm of the sands, she whispers a name. In the torturous heat of a moonless night, she looks into the darkness, defiant, determined. The dancer sat still, her head lowered, and in the darkness Gaara had this strange feeling, from her figure, from her smirk, that the girl sat in red was indeed love. Who is she calling for? Who is it that has such a vigilant follower? Tell us, who does love await? At the last syllable, the dancer lifted her head. AI looked straight to him, for she had eyes for no one else, and upon capturing his gaze, the skylark sang. I beckon that which claws at my heart and stifles my breath, suffocates me in anguish and breathes life into me. I await the tempest, and I reached out a hand for him. Come on to me, tempest, save me from this burning desert, reign over me, stain me with your color, steal me away with your callous words and beautiful song. You leave me desolate, untouched, writhing in need. If cruelty be your skill, then teach me. I am your undoubting follower. AI bowed to him, and Gaara had to close his eyes and take a breath, for Shikaka trembled at her actions, and Gaara began to feel that familiar ache at her words. Teach me, you heartless storm, how it is you leave me breathless. She stood, the sound of her jewelry tinkling around her. The blood-red color of her skirt swept up of the white stone floor as she twirled and spun. Naivete and lust breed merely dreams. A tempest shall never descend into our world. The desert shall never hear the drumming of thunder, nor the patter of raindrops. Foolish one, beautiful one, you have fallen under some spell. The women, all dressed in white as though purposely trying to blend into the background, moved around AI, but it did not matter to the Kazekage, for he could see only her. AI laughed at their words, and the gathered royalty and shinobi could see the courtesans giggling and applauding their comrade as her audience became captivated. I have felt the heat of a desert storm. I have tasted it. Like a spark of electricity, Kankuro realized that AI's words were offering something more dangerous to her audience than anyone else suspected. He leant forwards to Gaara with an idea to get him to leave, but the Kazekage predicted his siblings may interrupt, and so tilted his head back to Kankuro with a look of annoyance. He was not going to be mollycoddled any longer. AI was right. He had forgotten what it felt like to feel alive. I am but a victim of the tempest's curse, and now the thunder is here. It is my very heartbeat. Rain sounds at my footsteps, and lightning flashes here in these eyes. AI was slowly building a reputation that would lead to her downfall, in Temari's opinion, for she approached the Kazekage and the prince as though daring anyone to tell her not to get closer. She sat before the Kazekage, and the two were finally face to face, after long, difficult nights of not being able to know one another. Gaara had to break eye contact. Those eyes with that look again. He couldn't stand what it did to him, what she did to him. Come on to me, Tempest, she sang, but did not move, outraged that he could possibly tear his gaze from her, but she knew, as did the other dancers, that her words would get to him. Reign over me, stain me with your color. There was something in her words, like a spell, bringing up pictures of blood and pleasure and her and ecstasy. If cruelty be your skill, then teach me. I am your undoubting follower. She bowed before her Kazekage. Teach me, you heartless storm, how it is to love you. The musician struck the last note, and AI remained with her head bowed. Applause filled her ears. Words of commendation and proclamations of love came her way, but she waited for him to do something, to say something. Good night, Nobutara-san, until the morning. The Kazekage stood and walked straight past her. AI snapped her gaze up and turned to watch him leave. A look of distress slowly crept its way onto her face. She half wanted to scream at him. How dare he leave? How dare he ignore her? She saw his white robe steal out of the courtyard and up the steps to the Kazekage's quarters. AI stood slowly. That egotistical, malevolent, discourteous dash. I see the shoes I gave you were appreciated, someone commented, and AI turned back to see the prince looking down to her shoes. She suddenly remembered herself and swapped her look of utter outrage for one of happy surprise. The girl in blood red bowed to the prince. Thank you, your highness. AI remained stooped in her bow, for usually royalty would say something to make you stand again, but the boy said nothing. Instead, he put a finger to her chin and lifted her head. I did not catch your name in our first meeting, he whispered as those around them moved back into the hall where they had dinner. He lowered his hand from her face. AI, she replied with a small smile. A suitable name, the prince said almost to himself. And you? For a moment AI became lost in that mess of dark hair he had. Your highness? She added. Nobutara. Prince? Someone called out for him, and the two turned to see an elderly woman of the royal household beckoning him. He turned to her quickly and took her hand. Again, fate interrupts, the prince whispered. I will see you again, he murmured as he brought her hands up to his lips and softly kissed her. Ah, I gasped and withdrew from his grasp. Until then, she said and bowed quickly. Nobutara smiled. Her shyness now, after being so bold with her singing, was intriguing to him. Prince? The woman called again, and Nobutara left Ai standing on her own, staring after him. As he walked, he exuded such power and charisma. She saw other girls turn at the sight of him. Ai had bigger things on her mind for the moment, and turned to face the stairs the Kazekage had walked up. Ai? She glanced over her shoulder, and saw Megumi beckoning her. She knew Megumi was about to forbid her from doing the reckless thing she wanted to do, but Ai knew no force on earth could stop her from having one last chance to scold him. Her sensei's voice trailed away as she saw the glint in the young dancer's eye. It is your choice. Do as you wish. There was no stopping it now. The pages of a novel had begun to turn. That blood-red love was beginning to blossom, and who was she to get in the way of legend? The night was a velvet dark, humid, bleak and barren. Candles flickered in the palace, warming the air with the scent of sandalwood as the moon ascended to meet the storm. Drapes billowed and swayed on the Kazekage's balcony, beckoning in the night, calling Kismet to throw off the veil and reveal itself to the world. On nights like this, in these hours of isolation, locked away in his room, his blood used to boil. The hunger for death was insatiable, and the need to feel power surge through him was turning into desperation. All Gaara wanted was to let go, to unhinge the door that he had crafted between Shikaku and the world. To be swallowed whole by his insanity and taste blood was an overbearing instinct he was finding harder to silence. The Kazekage stood in the half-darkness of his bedroom. His shadow flickered against the wall in the candlelight. His hands gripped the chair at his dressing table with such force that his knuckles were white from the pain of clutching to sanity. His head bowed, Gaara's face furrowed and contorted as he fought against his instincts. He staggered his breathing, trying to remain in control, trying not to listen to Shikaku's whispers that were attempting to persuade him that it would all feel better if he followed that scent of blood on the air. Usually a cold moon would lend him company on nights like this, to cool his blood, to help him part with the lust. But there was no moon tonight. Ah! Shikaku raised his head at the thought of her, and Gaara gripped the frame of the chair so tightly a crack formed beneath his fingertips and ran along the wood, splintering the beautiful carvings, as though a blade had been run along the chair. He couldn't take this anymore. It was tearing him apart. He didn't want to hurt her. He didn't want to hurt anyone anymore. But his blood was boiling. His heart was pounding fit to burst. Kazekage? The temperature in the room plummeted at just the sound of her voice. Delicate and coy, the moon watched him from the doorway. Slowly, Gaara opened his eyes and looked up to the mirror in front of him. The grand, gold-framed mirror that hung on his dressing table. He saw her in its reflection. The side of Ai stood and read the color of blood, her fair skin glowing in the candlelight of his room, her bright eyes narrowing on him with that look that killed him. So pure and innocent, she was to be his undoing. His eyes were red, she noticed, his crimson waves of hair messy and rugged. The Kazekage stood hunched over his dressing table chair, his Kazekage robes abandoned to reveal his black clothes beneath. She had to take a breath and look away, for the feeling of want was turning into an ailment. He was her weakness, and she sighed deeply. No woman knew addiction, obsession, insanity, until you knew him. They looked at one another in the reflection of the mirror. The outside world was forgotten, a distant memory, a dream, no longer a hindrance. The silence stretched on as they appraised one another. The coldness of the moon fighting against the heat of his blood. A war was breaking out between them, and both were caught in the crossfire. Gaara bowed his head. He couldn't look at her anymore. The candles flickered as though cowering when he spoke suddenly. What did I do to deserve this torture? His voice was husky, as though his throat were sore and dry. Torture? She asked gently. Gaara looked back up at her reflection and growled. 2 years it took me to tame this beast, he snarled. This disease of madness. He shut his eyes tightly, as he felt Shikaku tremble. And yet, He looked up to her. In just a glance you unravel all that I have worked so hard to restrain. The frustration in his voice withered away. His shoulders slumped as he looked on at her, as though defeated. Kazuka, don't. He turned from the mirror to see her properly. Don't call me that. She bowed her head in respect for his wishes. There was something different about him in this moment. It is as though, all along, she had met the tied-up, responsibility-bound Kazekage, and finally, after weeks of waiting, she was meeting him. She was finally facing Gaara. I know you do it on purpose. He interrupted her thoughts. You do it to appease me. You think all this immorality will be forgotten if you coat this situation with honey-dipped words. He began to raise his voice against her, as she stood in silence. You think I don't know the games courtesans play? The games women play? You appease me, so I see past what you are. He winced as though the thought of it caused him pain. A whore. Gaara spoke so bluntly, so cruelly that AI recoiled. I detest it. It repulses me. You manipulate men and sell yourself for their pleasure. It is degrading, disgusting. I can't stand the thought of what you are. It was AI's turn to wince at his words as though they cut her. How could he be so cruel? Did he not know that it was not out of duty that she came here, but out of her own desire? She looked up at him, her eyes beginning to shine as frustration coursed through her. Why did he always accuse her of being dishonest? She opened her mouth to speak, but Gaara would not let her play her games of rhetoric with him. But it doesn't stop. He whispered as though to himself, but his tone was enough to stop AI in her tracks. He was no longer angry. He sounded defeated. Gaara looked to the floor, misery engulfing him. The pain of wanting you does not reside no matter how many times I tell myself that I should stay away from you. Gaara glanced up and gestured to the girl in the doorway. Who thought a woman of sin could look so much like an angel? With a small smile, AI shut the door with her foot and began to walk towards him. Why did no one warn me that the price of not seeing you for days would be agony? Ga, stay away from me. He shouted at her suddenly and lashed out his arm to stop her coming close. AI jumped and cowered a few feet away from him. She held her veil around her tightly like a shawl as it slipped from her head. Don't you understand what I am, AI? His eyes widened, manically almost, as he could not fathom why she would want to get closer. Doesn't it scare you? After we kissed I almost killed you. Is not that in itself enough to warn you that I am trouble?